see people in a way that I think is very beautiful. Like you see people as inherently fascinating, and you really take the time to see people. You put so much thought into this conversation. It was wonderful. Thank you for just having this. This is such a luxury that it exists in the world. I cannot wait for like hearing all of these conversations with all these different people that you have. Like I could listen to you have conversations with people for the rest of my life and be thrilled.
This is the Inner Landscape Travel Agency. Let's saunter across the psyche through creativity, self-discovery, and the sacred. If you're curious, playful, and seeking, welcome. Hi, Bethany.
Hello.
Thank you for joining for a conversational portrait. We recently met over our shared enthusiasm around interoception and self-awareness, and I've really enjoyed your curiosity, your exceptional ability to teach your personal brand of science, or as you describe it, discovering how far you can push the envelope on ridiculousness. So really, you embody one of my favorite traits in folks, quirkiness. Welcome, Bethany Ranes.
Hello, thank you. Yes, I would definitely say if I embody anything, quirkiness is very high on the list.
If we think about traversing our inner landscapes, going inward requires literal and figurative silence. In your life, where is that?
That's a difficult question because silence is definitely not at the top of the list. I am chatty. I live in a full house and work from my house with kiddos and a husband. I think, where I've always really just kind of found silence in motion, actually. When I was younger, I would go for long drives to nowhere and just kind of think about things and see things. And now I do a lot of walking around just to nowhere. And I find that I get a lot of aha moments when I'm just kind of by myself. I find a lot of peace being en route because you're really not supposed to be anywhere when you're en route to somewhere. So I think when I'm kind of moving around and not in a single place, I find a lot of solace in that.
When you are moving and finding the solace en route, what thoughts muddy up your silence?
Thinking about where else I need to be. I'm terrible about it. And I think that's why the movement helps me a lot. But I by nature am always thinking, what's next? What's next? What's next? Which sometimes can be a superpower, but a lot of times is a distraction. So, over the last several years of my life, I've worked a lot on being present and trying to get rid of that what's next obsession. Because it absolutely can take me away from just thinking, which I have found is actually an incredibly valuable part of the process whenever you're doing any kind of creative work, just kind of doing nothing and having that in-between time to let things percolate. So working on allowing that a little bit more.
Would you say that your thoughts about the future are ones that are they anxious about it, therefore they take you away from the present, or are they something that help you build up the present towards the future?
They're definitely high energy, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're often anxious. A lot of times they're excited. I think I have a terrible toxic trait of just easy boredom, and I have to be really careful with that. So I think it's oftentimes just the excitement of the next thing, whether that's the next project or the next client, the next appointment. Those can be problematic. But thinking about the next step of how something's going to evolve, that actually is a lot less distracting. So I have to kind of walk a balance because sometimes those thoughts about what's next, how can this be better? What should it do next? Well, those are critical to my work. And so thinking about those things can be very helpful, but I have to be careful because they quickly morph into like, yes, but what am I going to do, in the next hour? What am I going to make for dinner? What am I going to do tomorrow? So I kind of have to find a line to walk since the answer really isn't black and white.
Of the thoughts you have, what kinds or what types do you most enjoy having?
Just like I love aha moments. My gosh, I think everyone does. I mean, you're neurochemically wired to love your aha moments, but there's just something about that sense of connecting two previously disparate ideas. I mean, there's nothing cognitively better than that, I don't think. Maybe nostalgia. I think that's like it would be a close second, but oh, I adore any time. And I think my favorite part about an aha kind of thought or moment is that they're completely uncontrolled, unplanned. I can't have them on purpose. No one really can. So I get so excited. My husband teases me all the time. Like, last night was a really good example. Like right before bed, I had this idea for a strategy that just kind of came to me, and I had to write it down. So he comes out and was like, you know, furiously scribbling on an iPad, and he doesn't even anymore. He's just usually like doesn't even ask because he knows exactly what I'm going to say. But I'm surrounded by notebooks and pens because I love an aha moment, and I love just how valuable they can really be.
Aha moments are very, and maybe even nostalgia, they both feel full bodied. Aha, like you're synthesizing
Yes.
something across its ideas, different sides of the head coming together, and maybe different
Yeah.
facets of reality. Nostalgia, kind of, it's this, you get to immerse yourself in the past again in this wavy, emotionally laden memory, and you get to relive it. And those that strikes me as like, it's a thought and a sensory experience. It's this combination.
Oh, heavily sensory. I like to think of nostalgia as being the sensations of the past with the thoughts of the present. So you're revisiting the feelings that you had back then, but you get to come at it with the perspective of who you are right now. And I think that's why it always has that feeling of grief, which is also oddly pleasant, so paradoxical, but because you're conscious of the fact that it's a go, that it's no longer, but you're also able to like reflect on these feelings that were very real. They may not be the same present reaction your body would have right now. And I think that's kind of beautiful that your body can do that and your brain can do that, to live in two moments simultaneously like that, and to be aware that you're doing it, I think is very cool. Physicists always talk about superposition and it's impossible, and Schrodinger's cat, and all of these things. But I think that that's kind of an interesting neuroscientific version of superposition. Like you can feel the past while still being in the present.
I'm wondering if this question might then be redundant. Other than those, what are your favorite sensory experiences?
I mean, I nostalgia is a high one, of course. I mean, it seems like it's such a vanilla answer, but awe, just being humbled and having that part of my cognition just sort of turn off for a second
Mm-hmm.
and just to experience the sensations around me. I think it's kind of it's an again, it's like one of those feelings that, of course, we're programmed to love the feeling of awe, but that doesn't make me love it any less.
It's surprising to me to hear it referred to as awe, and I mention that because I remember reading about, this is maybe half a, 5 years ago, about the shortage of awe that we have, and how this lack of it, its absence is quite detrimental to us and for us, and that by being around it again, it's that feeling of interconnection of, hey, yes, we're a part of
Yes.
everything, and also we're a small part of it.
Yeah. Yes. Borderline inconsequential. Awe, one of the things I really love about it is that you can kind of see that there's a bit of a formula for it when you start studying the predictive power of the brain and how it works. And our sudden understanding, the collective aha moment we had about how our brain works. Yeah, I once described it to a colleague that awe is when you have absolutely no good predictive priors for a situation, but you have safety. So you can just sort of take in all this newness, and your brain can soak it in and add it to the repertoire, which is a beautiful feeling and an exciting feeling. And it's kind of the polar opposite of trauma, where you have that uncertainty, but you're fearful and you don't know, which also takes in a crazy amount of data and sensory memory, but in a way that's now tinged with fear and threat. Whereas awe does the same thing, but tinged with joy and insight. And one thing when I was kind of playing around with this idea was, wow, a baby, this was years ago before I had my own daughter, but a baby in a safe environment would be in a near continuous state of awe. And I remember being so intrigued by that idea, which is totally not testable, but kind of fun to think about. I wrote it on a sticky note just to let it live. I stuck it to my office wall, and anytime somebody would come in and notice it, they always kind of had like a, oh, and I noticed people with children particularly were like, I like that. And then when I had my own daughter, she is in what feels like kind of a near continuous state of awe. And I love that. And I love knowing that that's what that feels like, for her, for any kiddo. So yeah, it's an area I find particularly fascinating and potentially very, very therapeutic. And I agree, the lack of it is unfortunately, it's very harmful. So everybody get out there, do things that are unpredictable for you safely.
I recently heard this description of psychedelics as you have the awe, loose connections of a toddler, but you have the cognitive faculties of an adult. And that reminded me of just the quote you mentioned earlier about nostalgia.
Yeah, I've never thought of it that way, but yes, I think one of the reasons I'm a big proponent of the idea of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and I'm a big supporter of a lot of the work that's being done there. Of course, a lot of work still to be done, but it's the only thing I can think of. It gets into that default mode network where we have all of our predictions and our expectations, and particularly around ourselves and our self definition. To loosen those up is sort of unheard of in a psychiatric context. Of course, you can do it through practice meditation and things like that, but that takes time. It takes practice. It takes lifestyle. It hasn't been realistic for a lot of people. So the idea that we can now find a way to sort of temporarily loosen those connections, I agree. I think it's one of the closest ways we can mimic awe, and folks who have had psychedelic experiences often refer to them as awe-inspiring. So yeah, it's very intriguing, but I love that. Yeah, the idea that it's sort of, yeah, like visiting your infant sense of infinite potential, but knowing the things that you know as whoever you are now.
On the opposite side of awe, or maybe diagonal from awe, is things you're not a fan of. And I have to ask, what is your beef with sneezes?
Oh my gosh, I hate it when people sneeze. I have hated it when people sneeze. I am such a jerk since I was like a teenager, maybe even before. It's because my attention span is like a -3. If I were a character in like a role playing game, my attention skill set would definitely be in the red. It is terrible. So I think it started in school where I would be like trying to concentrate on something and it would be taking like all of my mental faculties, and then someone would sneeze and I couldn't not pay attention to it because it just would grab my attention. Oh, and I'd get so frustrated and I'd have to like sit there and build up my attention all over again to whatever I was doing. So if I'm in a meeting or I'm like concentrating or I'm working and somebody sneezes, I get so irrationally frustrated. But I know I'm irrationally frustrated. So at least I'm not a complete like jerk about it. But if ever you're around me and you sneeze and you see me like roll my eyes like Robert Downey Jr., please know it's not personal. I know it's me. It's not you.
One of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you was the perspective you have about the world. And one of the areas that I have a deep fascination about, and I think we share this, is when we can look at the same thing, whether we're in the same room or remotely, and we experience it fundamentally differently. So I know I'll never quite know who you are, what it's like to be you as a person, but I want to get close to that. And I want to understand through your unique set of life experiences and knowledge and skills, what do you see today that few others can? Where do you see the more depth, nuance, and intricacy? And I came across a quote that you like to reference from the Nobel Prize winning Hungarian biochemist Albert, I'm gonna Chent Georgi. He said,
Yes, it's very difficult to pronounce that. I congrats to you.
Researches to see what everyone else has seen and to think what no one else has thought. And
Yes.
I, I think that it so thoroughly embodies not just research, but the the individual apertures available to us. If we think of the universe as that wonderful J shape of the eyeball looking into itself, like, well, then we all have those individual ones. What is the unique aperture available to you that you see in a room, and you just see more depth in there?
Well, I love that you brought in that quote is like my life mantra. I have two of them. That is one of them. But I think, well, actually, the other quote that really shapes me is the other half of the answer to this. So I also really love the quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And huge sci-fi fan. And I think that might be at the heart of it. Is that I believe in the magic of the world that we live in. I don't think magic is fantasy. I think that we're surrounded by it, but we're so normalized to it that we don't even recognize it. And I just kind of I think that novelty of trying to take the time to see something for the first time every time, see something I didn't see before, and kind of appreciate what magic is in this, like what magic is captured by this, because there's all sorts of things that I kind of just I think are so powerful and so amazing. And again, it just we're so blessed and inundated with this constant flow of evolving technology and these kind of things that would have been miracles even 100 years ago, 50 years ago. And so just that sense of being able to step out of my experience for a second and just kind of be a blank human, a blank perceiver, and see things for what they are, allows me to see things that are more magical, more fun, more just there's a whole layer. And if you just think of it based on utility, it may seem sort of boring, but if you think of it for what it really is, it's suddenly very exciting. And so I try to come at everything that way. What's magic about this? What's the adventure in this? Like this isn't an activity, it's an adventure. What is the adventure? And I think it really came from just when I was a kid. Like I said, I have an easy I tend to be easily bored if I don't do something about it. And I think as a kid, I realized I don't like to be bored. So let me make this. I need to do this, right? You're in the car, you're driving somewhere. It's not going to be fun. Make it something fun. Make the adventure. And it's a skill that I'm grateful that I was able to develop because it makes everything just so colorful and bright as a human.
The notion of boredom, or our concepts of boredom, have shifted between, call it 2000, pre and post 2000, because especially now
Yeah.
we have the devices we have. There's no cassette tape or CD that you wait to listen to. Everything is far more of our life is on demand. The stimuli are available to us when we want them. I'm curious about how your relationship with boredom and your ways of tackling it or exploring it were different through different phases of your life.
So yeah, we live in a world where it's increasingly difficult to be bored, right? And I see that with my kiddos, and it's something that I worry about because if you aren't bored, you don't develop the ability to sort of internally
Mm-hmm.
stimulate. And I see that with them sometimes. It's not even that they don't like boredom; it's almost like they don't even know what it is. They don't even recognize it sometimes. They're just so constantly externally stimulated, and so I don't like that because you're giving too much power to your environment when that happens. And so we try really hard to do a lot of lo-fi things and understand that like a time of non-stimulation is a time for you to take that power back and create whatever you want, whatever universe you want to be in. And I think that that's, something that not everybody is thinking to do. Certainly the message you're going to get from marketing and mass media is consumption is great because of course they're making so much money off of it. But that constant consumption is just giving all of the, you're slowly taxing yourself and giving the entirety of your feelings and your internal universe to the outside. And there's enough just like rebellious screw you in me for that to like really motivate me not to do it, not to give that power up to anybody who would demand it. Like that's mine. And I want to kind of help get that like sort of hard bite in my kids too, like making sure that they're like, this is mine to cultivate as I
Mhm.
choose, and understand the value and the power of that. So I would say the same for everyone. I hope that anybody out there, like, take a minute and make sure you're not accidentally, you know, giving up too much of that internal world that you have, because it's yours to do whatever you want with, and you shouldn't let external things control it all the time.
A couple of months ago, I think this was just as spring was really beginning to awaken here in the mountains. I became more aware of the parallels between the nurturing the garden, the landscape, and nurturing our own inner one. And you want that wonderful forest and the prairies, but to do that, the nurturing is the inward looking, is the inward deliberate acts, and giving it the time, or at least the time, or the downtime, or the downtime time, to for it to grow. And otherwise it's filled. Well, if there's anything there, I wonder if, is it a persistently fecund environment that just keeps getting wiped off, like this, a volcano that passes through? Or is it at some point, does it atrophy so much? But there's still potential
Mm.
there. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that this idea of this practice that you have with your kids of the lo-fi living, in seeing how they view the world with awe, in empathizing with that so strongly. How are you connecting with your kids around their development? Because you know what's ahead of them, you can see that, and you also know which way you want to help nudge.
My gosh, it's been the hardest thing ever. So I came into my relationship with my husband now, and I am a stepmom to his two kiddos who are older. And I was terrified because I knew that no matter what I did, I'd be nudging them somehow, being a part of their lives. And I was always so scared because I just thought, like, I'm a little, I'm quirky, I'm odd, and I never saw myself as being particularly maternal. And I was just afraid I was going to be a bad influence on them. So I was always constantly like very self conscious about it. And then realized as I came to just really love them and care about them so much, like the hard part is not trying to steer the boat for them out of like pure, is stepping back and letting them make mistakes, and learning what that is, and then just being there to help them to learn from those mistakes. That's so valuable, and not something that everybody learns to do early in life, is accepting sort of defeats as temporary but very valuable lessons, and applying those to future behavior. And I see how hard that can be. When you're young, your brain's still developing, and it's so easy to fall into like the same patterns. Do like, you just got burned, I'm gonna go touch it again, and like trying to figure out what can I do to help them to stop. Because what I've noticed, and then I've really applied to like other adults myself, is how hard it is to admit the first defeat and not want to say, this was a mistake. I made a mistake. I failed a little bit here. We're so, I think in Western culture, we're like just so trained against that. You have to be successful all the time. You have to win all the time. And in doing that and trying to erase the failures or rewrite what happened as a non-failure, you lose the lessons. And so it's not so much that they're not like learning from the lessons per se. It's like they're not stopping to admit defeat, which is totally fine. I want to normalize defeat sometimes because, and I realize I need to do that for myself. I need to be graceful with people who are trying to do that or unable to do that as adults. It's helped me a lot with empathy in general, just recognizing how difficult it can be depending on your upbringing. But for most of us in the United States, it was tough for all of us. Like we just don't see positive stories of loss and defeat and failure. And so we don't know how to come to terms with that. But when you don't, you lose it and you get stuck in these behavior loops that are toxic and not helpful for you. And you're making the same mistakes over and over and unable to learn from them and having to like reframe your narrative every time and how it's a win and and like I should do it again. And um so yeah, I would say, trying to help them through that without doing it for them and helping them learn their own lessons so that they can move forward through life and like, you know, understand and never fail the same way twice. That's the goal. I hope I can be helpful with them for that because I think that's at the end of the day one of the most valuable things you can have as an adult person.
You mentioned not feeling a maternal instinct when you were younger, and you also I learned from other podcast interviews that you didn't want to be a therapist, proactively did not want to be one. Is there a connection there? And I
Yeah.
ask because like I think I've associated those who are in the coaching therapeutic space to be nurturers. That seems to be
Yeah.
one of the major descriptions. And everything you've described about your relationship and how with your kids and how deliberate you are there sounds nurturing.
It does. It's my own brand of nurturing, I think. And it's a brand that I maybe didn't see whenever you traditionally think of someone who is nurturing. Um, while it sounds all well and good, I think I have a lot of empathy as a person, and it's something that I'm grateful for. I do not have a lot of patience, and I think that the other side of nurturing is patience. And it's not that I get irritable necessarily. I just like I think like, oh, it's not going to happen. Like moving on. It's fine. Just deal with it. Um, and so I think that, that definitely plays into it. A big part of it, it's going to sound silly, but it comes down to this experience I had. I was like, I don't know, probably 11 years old. I think I was in the seventh grade, maybe eighth grade. I might have been 12. But we used to, in California, it was this thing. I think every public junior high had to do it. You got this baby doll that was um, realistic, right? And it cried and it was like the same weight and size as a real baby. I don't know if you had to do this, but like you had to carry it around. Like you had to parent this baby for, I think it was like 24 to 48 hours. And if it cried, you had to put this key in its back and feed it like for a certain amount of time. And it had to like, it couldn't be jostled and it was a whole thing. And you got graded based on this little computer chip that was inside of it that like essentially indexed how good of a job you took care of this baby. And um, I spent my entire 24 to 48 hours experimenting with what I could get away with without the baby like being triggered in some way. And it was like a pure just experimentation of like, could I do this? Can I do this? What's the bare minimum effort I could like produce here? And my mom like walked in, it was like the middle of the night, and I had found I could like place the key gently but not enough to trigger that it was in the baby. It was like on its back, and I had it like carefully balanced on like a platform I had built out of like books and things. And when it would cry at night, I could just kind of whack the key and it would go where it needed to go. And then when it stopped, I could kind of like pull it and it would go back to where it was. And I remember my mom just laughing and being like, yikes. And all the other, like a lot of, not all, but like a lot of the other girls my age would like love this, like, oh, and then the baby's name is this. Like they had so much fun like treating it like a real baby. And I didn't have nearly as much interest in that as like how this thing worked and what the thresholds were and like what can I get away, like what can you do, and is it even real, or is this all a conspiracy and like everyone gets the same grade. um and from that point on I was like, well, maybe I'm just not maternal. And then whenever I went to grad school, the therapy thing, I knew I wanted to be a scientist. I was less interested in fixing things, more interested in how they worked, kind of breaking them almost, and like looking at all of their parts and getting it. And so I knew that the idea of fixing people one at a time really didn't interest me. I completely understand the value. I respect and adore people who have that passion. It's just not, I would love to just know exactly how your brain works. I'd spend your entire psychoanalysis session just like interestingly trying to untie the knots of how your brain worked, but never like putting it back together. I'm a bad clockmaker. In my first semester of grad school, they had all of us do both clinical and research courses to make sure, like, oh, let's put you in the thing that you seem to have a natural aptitude for. And my advisor was like, at the end of the semester, like, did you have any interest in being a clinical psychologist? I was like, no, absolutely not. They're like, that's good. That's probably for the best. I think that you, I think that you definitely have a natural tendency towards the research side of things. So I just got a lot of feedback throughout my life, that that's just who I was. But I realize now when you care very much about somebody, and I've always been this way with my friends and just kind of didn't notice. And now that I have a family, like I feel this with my family, like I do very much care about helping them fix things, probably to a fault. And I have to take a step back, but it's not the same for people I genuinely love. I'm not trying to take them apart. I adore them. I want them to be as happy and thriving as possible at all times. And so I hurt deeply when they hurt. And so I think I've come to realize like I am actually an empathetic and caring person. I just don't have that same drive professionally.
I've heard you describe how, in studying things from a neuroscience and biological perspective, the stigma washes away from some. You understand why somebody would do something, like the kind of
Yes.
patterns there. And I think what I'm hearing there is, with what you just described, of you know how to take something apart, and therefore you understand, if you were to put it back together, how it all work.
Yeah.
And therefore some of the shame aspects of the mystery fade away. And so you can observe someone's behavior and think, I roughly know why they're doing what they're doing, or what might be behind that. Which, how does that affect how you understand the world?
I always grew up with like a complicated relationship with shame. I think just being a girl in the 90s, there was a lot of shaming. It was a time where it was a little rough, like you needed to look a certain way and act a certain way. There was a lot of shame, body shame and just shame about who you were. But I'm very grateful. My mom was very big on making sure my brother and I saw people from lots of different walks of life and respected them as people and understood them. And I really thank her for that because, one of the big things we used to do, we'd go to San Francisco. I grew up in Northern California, Central Valley. And we would go to San Francisco and she would have us helping out at some of these big churches in the mission where there's lots and lots of like folks who are homeless or addicted to drugs and kind of the sorts of people that oftentimes my friends who had more conservative parents would shame, right? They're lazy, they need to get a job, they're blah, blah, blah. And my mom was always very adamant, these are people. Right now, they need our help, and they don't need our help understanding what they've done wrong. They need our help getting some food. They need our help finding a place to sleep tonight. They've made mistakes. They might make more mistakes, but everybody deserves kindness and everybody deserves help if they're needing help. And that really resonated, I think, with me and my brother both. We grew up to have a pretty high tolerance, for just lots of different kinds of people and a pretty low shame threshold. I'm losing, the older I get and the more I dig into these things, the more and more I'm like, shame is got very little value. And all emotions have adapted from something. So even shame shouldn't be shamed. But like it's tough for me to, it's so
Mhm.
overused. And so I grew up with that. And I think it helped me just dig in really deep as a neuroscientist to just understand that there's a reason for why things happen. And there is. And I'm very fond of adaptive sort of evolutionary psychology and the evolutionary influences of science. So, like behavioral adaptations and things like that. I find a lot of that very fascinating. And I've loved how the evolutionary biologists have contributed to like behavioral science and psychology, like Sapolsky and those folks. And it's taught me that everything adapts. And it may not always be currently helpful, but it adapted from something. And it helped me see things like addiction. Depression was a big one. I really changed my ideas on depression. I kind of went through a more clinically oriented grad school disease model of depression, right? Prominent most places, still very prominent. And I remember sitting down at a treatment resistant depression event one time. And I was there as kind of a panel. Most folks were patients or patient advocates. And I was at the time working for like a corporate overlord. So I was already like probably walking the line of being very much the most hated person in that room. The first thing I said, and I thought, oh God, B, that was a horrible way to start. And I didn't mean to. I'm surprised somebody threw tomatoes at me. It was, I don't believe that depression is a disease. Oh God. And like, I think everybody was just going to like get up and just like mob me. And I was like, it's a condition of being. And if you look at it, it's almost completely identical to sickness behavior. And we call sickness behaviors just a state of being. They're not a disease either. They happen when you're sick and they happen when your body needs a rest. They're all very adaptive. Depression is a sickness behavior that indicates some kind of social psychological pressure, learned helplessness of some kind. You've run out of options for changing or solving the problems in your environment that are affecting you. And your body just starts to shut down and try and rest and do what it can and heal. And we call that depression. And we're so ashamed of it and we're so afraid of it. And people feel like it's somehow a sign of weakness. And it's like, my gosh, no, it's is a fever a sign of weakness? No, of course not. But yet they're so similar. And so that kind of a mindset, it started really coming to me that like I kind of hate the DSM. It's not my favorite. I do not enjoy it. I do not enjoy that it continues to get thicker. Because I think so often we can't apply this idea of a disease model to so many things that we experience as people. And I think that idea robs folks of hope, and it like makes them feel like they're broken instead of magnificent, which is what truly a lot of these things indicate to me. Like the fact that your body has a process by which it can deal with a persistent and devastating external force that's affecting your life every day, and you don't just like roll over and die. Like you have something. Your body has like a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. And and that people would be ashamed of their body, and their mind going through these amazing adaptive plans is it breaks my heart. It's like another thing they don't need. So I like to let people know, like, certainly it's uncomfortable. Certainly it's distressing. And we don't want you to be stuck there. No, nobody wants to be sick. Nobody wants those sickness behaviors. Nobody wants that. But you also should never feel ashamed of that. Like that's your body doing something kind of amazing and something that has kept us as a species alive and thriving and evolving for so long. So I hate when people feel like they're genetically broken or they're just broken as a person. And it's like, no, no, no. Like you're working exactly as you should. And unfortunately, it's kind of your environment right now that sounds like it might be dysfunctional, and we should work on that. So the biopsychosocial approaches that are taking much more, wing, particularly in the medical community and in the psychological community, for sure, in the psychiatric communities, I'm very grateful for, because I think we really need to stop and take a look at like, this person is reacting healthily and normally to a sick situation, not a sick person that needs to be fixed. Like they need to, be assisted. Like this person doesn't need you to fix them, but they do need food. Like this person doesn't need me to sit here and tell them what's wrong with them, but they might need a meal right now. They might need something right now. So I think of often like when I was a kid, like it really isn't that different from when you're working with folks who are in a rough situation. And the best thing you can do is not sit there and diagnose them, make them feel broken, but to like just what's going on in their environment that's contributing to these issues that I can maybe take some of that off for them. It's a really long answer. So sorry.
Only long answers are acceptable. You described how your mother encouraged you to understand the people who were there.
Yeah.
When have you felt understood?
When I felt understood. My gosh. What a beautiful question. I mean, I think that's the hallmark of most of the really truly meaningful lasting relationships I've had. And I tend to be a friendly person, but I don't always have really long standing relationships. I move a lot. I do a lot of changes. Everybody does, and everybody's going through their lives. But I have a couple of, friends I've been friends with a very long time. Like I am still in regular contact with a friend that I met in seventh grade English class, and my best friend from college, my first freshman roommate, is still incredibly dear to me, and of course my husband and my family. I think all of those people understand me, and I understand them, and I think that's why the relationship lasts through change because it's never it's never predicated on particularly changeable things. It's I think when you understand someone and you feel understood by them, you know that whatever bonds that you have are very flexible. They're elastic, and as you change and your life changes, they change with you. And I think that's really rare, but I think it's very beautiful. So in those relationships that have just surpassed every phase I could possibly have, it tells me that it wasn't who I was in that phase, which is nothing wrong with that. Like I don't begrudge anyone. There was something valuable about our connection in that phase of our lives, but maybe not as useful afterwards, and that's okay. I think that that person understood me at that moment, but maybe not now. And so, yeah, those people who have ridden the tides, I think, are the ones who make me feel understood.
What about misunderstanding? What's a time?
Oh, that's much
What
easier.
what's a time where you've been the most impactful time you've been misunderstood?
Ooh, the most impactful time. Yeah, I tend to be a perennial misunderstood. I I am unexpected. So folks who like things a certain way, sometimes they see me and um, immediate misunderstandings abound. Okay, there were two, and they were very similar. I am a person who did not come from an academic family. I came from more of a working class family, hardworking folks, very creative, very smart people, but just never had the resources or support to go to college. And I was the first in a very long line of people to go to college at all, and definitely the first to get a PhD in a very very long time. But that doesn't mean that I was like the first successful or intelligent person in my family. And that always really bothered me. That people would just kind of assume something like that, like I was a freak accident or something. I come from a line of brilliant people who were able to really thrive and succeed in their roles with what they had, and I love that about myself. Like I love the line of people I come from, and my ability to bring that to what I'm doing now. But there have been some people who see, I went to Fresno State, University, which go dogs. It's not exactly Ivy League, but I needed to go to a place I could afford that was relatively close to home, and I loved it. And Fresno State gave me everything I needed to succeed, so I appreciate it. But in the place where I am now, I am grateful that I've made it to this place in my career where a lot of folks went to really, really good schools. They're coming from families who have a history of going to those schools. And I'm in a very different group of people sometimes. Two times I have been misjudged and misunderstood because I come from a more humble, quote unquote, background. They looked at my CV and they made a decision about me. And they saw me come in and they see this like punk haired kid who's like on a skateboard wearing like a concert t shirt or something. That was the more like college time. I don't usually do that anymore. But I do still have punk hair. Anyway, I walked in one time. This was to a postgraduate training. It was very prestigious. I was really excited. This was the first time I was able to do work with like an Ivy League system. And I was just nervous. And I was excited to learn from people and kind of see what it was like. But I was like a little afraid, like, imposter syndrome, of course. And I was told by the person who ran the program as soon as I walked in, like, I saw your background. You're not going to be able to do this. This is a very advanced course. And I think you need to I don't think you're going to be able to succeed. Like, go home, kind of a thing. Like, I don't think you're going to succeed here, which was really bold. And I was furious, like furious that somebody would just make such a deep assumption about me on a piece of paper to just assume I was somehow less than, that I was less intelligent or less determined because of where I came from and maybe how I looked. And I just looked him dead in the eye and I was just like, I disagree. I'm ready to give it a try. And I worked my ass off in that. And I ended up understanding it better than a lot of the Ivy League students that were there. And they asked for my help tutoring. And so I was helping teach them things that we were learning in the courses. And he was there and he saw that. And he apologized to me, to be fair, when we finished this little, this course that I was part of. At the end of it, we all kind of did our graduation, and he apologized for misreading me. But I was still so angry that he would do that. And then it happened again at a job when I was in a career, and I had a meeting with a supervisor, and I'd been doing really well in this position, so I was like really proud of myself, and I thought maybe he was going to give me like a high five or something. And he just had a meeting with me to tell me that I wasn't what he thought of as world class. And I was like, oh, like shocked, like, oh my God, I must have been making mistakes. How embarrassing. So I was just like, can you please walk me through it? Like, tell me what mistakes I've been making. And it wasn't that I had been making mistakes. It wasn't that the work I was doing was substandard. It wasn't that there was any issues with what I was doing. It was because of what I came from. It was because I didn't have the credentials. I didn't have the pedigree. And they wanted somebody impressive. And I was deemed unimpressive. And everybody thinks they're impressive. So I feel a little arrogant saying like, oh, they misunderstood me. But I think that they misread me. I think that they dismissed a lot of what makes me me. And that's just like kind of, I'm very fiercely determined and I'm very curious. And I just will find joy in solving problems, no matter what they may be. The harder the problem, the better. And I think to write me off because of something as silly as where somebody goes to school or where they're from, it's rough, So those have really shaped. I say they're the most impactful because they've shaped me so much. I've kind of and I am thankful for them. I'm grateful for those. At first, they definitely instilled a lot of imposter syndrome, which I did not appreciate. But I realized as I moved through them, both of them happened, thankfully, when I was fairly young. So I was able to recognize them for what they were. And now I'm still relatively young, but like I'm able to move forward knowing that people are out there. That doesn't mean that they're right. And I can double down on whatever it is I want to double down on. I can have blue hair. I can wear a concert t-shirt. It's fine. I can do things how I do them. It doesn't make me less than. It just makes people who are very used to a certain cookie cutter way of doing things uncomfortable. They're going to misunderstand me, and that's okay. So I think I'm very appreciative for those two instances, but yeah, they were big ones to get through.
In doing things in your own way and perceiving the world as you do, can you introduce me to your intuition and where it's guided
Oh
you?
gosh. I mean, you I have no filter. Every word you've heard me say is probably 98% intuition, very little forethought, very little. My poor prefrontal cortex is just it's exasperated with me. I my intuition, I wish I could introduce you to my intuition. I don't know how to explain or understand or even describe it. I just know that I'm I'm what my husband likes to. He's a card player, and he likes to say I'm a feel based player. Just sometimes you're in the woods and a path looks interesting. Like maybe there's some flowers. Maybe it just has a little bit more sunlight coming down, whatever it may be. Sometimes I just feel a path and I want to go down it. It feels right. Sometimes it's the wrong path. Like I'm not 100%, but I find that it doesn't often, the more I use it, the more I listen to it, the better it gets, the more accurate it tends to be. As a neuroscientist, I think I can explain it like boring. It's all of those kind of unconscious connections I've made through my experiences, through these sensory perceptions. It's seeing similarities, it's seeing patterns. And I think understanding that it's not just random, but it's patterns that I just can't articulate with language. It's patterns that I just can't apply my concepts to. I don't have the concepts. Not even that I don't have the words. I don't even have the filters. But they're there. I trust those patterns. I trust my my hippocampus. I trust my default mode network. So I think that when it comes to a lot of these things, I'm not afraid to just sort of like relax and okay, I'm feeling like this sort of push to go this way. I'm going to go this way. I couldn't tell you why. I couldn't describe it. And it could be that if I didn't go that way, I went, left instead of right, I still would have had a good outcome. So sort of like, survivorship bias, of course. But um, I think understanding a little bit about how intuition works, just very in a cold clinical way, helps me to feel like I know this isn't just nothing, but I don't have, by nature, by design, by definition, I don't have the concepts to define it properly. So I'll just let her be.
Let's tie intuition to two other in words: interoception and instinct.
I love those words. I mean, I think for me, instinct and intuition largely go hand in hand. I would have a very difficult time pulling those apart. Other than maybe instinct has something a shared, where intuition might be a little bit more personal. Instinct is something that maybe your ancestors have given you a little help with too. And I like, thanks, ancestors. Appreciate you. Interoception. I mean, I named my company after it. I love it so much. I think it's such an undersell that whenever we teach kids about their senses, we're like, oh, you have five senses, and one of them's touch. I'm like, oh, touch. You really get the short end of the stick. The the amazing rainbow of what lives under touch. My God, like your tactile sense is so amazing. Like your nervous system is just truly amazing. And so this whole idea of interoception, that you have this like inner sense, but it's like a barometer and not precise, because if you could feel what your spleen was doing precisely all the time, you would lose your mind. You would go insane. So it's like that you've evolved to be able to have this amazing inner sense of how you're working in such a complex system of so many things that can go right and wrong, but yet it's tempered in just such a way that you get them in like flashes of feeling and flashes of emotion and flashes of sensation that are, I don't know, like beyond precision, beyond words, but yet not so distracting. They're so subtle and they build, and they're so kind of tidal, um, so that they don't distract you, pull you away, drive you insane. Like, I'm sorry, but that is so cool. Like, how do you not get so excited about like extraception's cool? Like obviously, and proprioception, very cool. But yeah, interoception. The fact that I have this, that I'm governed inside, not by like a specific little emperor that lives in the brain, right? But like this just, it's all governed by feeling. It's very, very cool to me. So I geek out on interoception. I think it's very amazing. When I talk about the magic of things, man, interoception has got a lot of it.
One of the things you referenced just now about knowing how your body works and being aware of it, there's at some point, and I think maybe it's a very hazy space, but at some point we cross into a metacognition portion, because some of us may be
Yes.
more attuned, and perhaps maybe we have a predisposition to be very attuned, and maybe we don't develop that because of our environment, because it's something that we haven't nurtured in ourselves. We have the ability to just have to nurture that side, so we have the ability to become more interoceptive. And there comes a point where if you're intentionally training it, yes, we have these biological elements, and then you have metacognition, which is a cultural element. And depending on what culture you're in, you're steering your awareness into a certain direction. And so the visual I have is
Sure.
almost of the sturdiness of biology, of the brain structures, and then the flimsiness of the culture on top of it. And that's metacognition, training us, guiding us to how we might learn to become more deliberately aware. And one of the places that then takes me is, well, what about our parents or grandparents or great grandparents? There was a different culture around this type of self awareness, and yet you described the wisdom of your family. And
Yeah.
from a different conversation, I know that you have farmers in the family, and they were so attuned to the world, and so it's hard for me to reconcile what it means to be in for someone to be in a relationship with themselves and with the landscape, because they may not be in a culture that's taught them or from which they were able to learn themselves, or maybe in environments where they would have learned from themselves independent of the culture about their metacognition. So where I'm trying to go with this is, how do you where does metacognition and where does awareness of the world around you feel extraordinarily contemporary, and where does it feel more of a, to invoke the ancestors, more of a timeless element?
I love invoke the ancestors. That's a lovely turn of phrase. How does it feel more like what is mine from like the recency and what has been given to me? I have a clear sciency filter over everything I think of. I can't help it. The language of how things work, largely for me, is very neuroscientific, just from all of my work and my mentors and the people who have taught me. Because so much of neuroscience, for me at least, has been defining indefinable things. So I didn't have a definition for them. I had a feeling for them or an experience for them, but not a definition for them. So oftentimes I lean on that in my metacognition, the sciency-ness of it, the technical language, the understanding of how the guts inside the thing work. But I think that there's still, that's a fairly small percentage of what goes on and my relationship to things. I mean, our capacity and our relationship for the landscape around us and the things that are around us, both locally and just even hypothetically. I mean, it's infinite. And to to sound briefly like a psychonaut here, I just don't see that there's a clean line about where those things start and end. So the whole thing is so without clean lines and boundaries. So I try to apply what I can, but I do think a lot of, for me, the cultural aspects often come down to like a mix of, I'll say utility, but it's a lot warmer than that. The gifts of things that they can give to you and that you can use to give to others is a big part of the culture I came from. So they saw utility, but it was never described in like such cold language. They were farmers or people who worked with the land around them, but never in like an industrial way. I think of my mom's dad, my grandfather. He was obviously deeply emotionally connected to the land and animals and just the ecosystems. He worked as a farmer and he worked for some very large farms, but at no point was it business. At no point was it science. It was it was a lot of like it's like almost like friendships. Like he had relationships with these things and he knew their names and like he knew their temperaments and he knew um just how they got along with things. So it almost feels like a when I think about how my family has taught me to think of things, they feel like old friends. They feel like or enemies, but they feel like people. They anthropomorphize a lot, and so even I'll find myself when I'm talking about my garden with my mom, or talking about her garden, we will call something he or she. Like she's looking really good this year, or whatever. So I think that is always an interesting line, and so I try not to lose that. So it belongs to me too. But I think the new layer I've added to that metacognition that I can definitely see is going to, I try to pass both down to my kids. I want them to have both. So it's kind of like I would imagine how a biologist thinks of their friends and family. Like, how they work. Like if you were to slice them open, what they'd look like, but that's not your relationship with them. And so I feel like that's sort of been my metacognitive experience with things around me and how I was raised to think of them.
You mentioned in your grandfather's relationship with, well, use the words about your grandfather that it wasn't business, it wasn't commerce. And as you're describing that it was relationships, it was being aware of the temperament of the people, the land, the animals, whatever overlap thereof. The term business just felt so anachronistic. Like that's such a contemporary term.
Yeah.
It's not applicable then because it was almost like he's what you were describing felt like it could have been in any era. And what
Yeah.
we refer to perhaps as business, and maybe it's a very narrow definition of business, seems so stubbornly contemporary or inescapably contemporary. And it's such a fascinating way to look at or to conceive of our interaction. Yes, we anthropomorphize something, but maybe that we've always done that. Maybe we could use a little bit more of that. That the mystique leaves if we don't do that, and therefore we treat it as this, as if it's somehow not a part of us, or as if we're not a part of what's around us. The word I was trying to intentionally avoid using there is as part of it, because that they're probably using no more objectifying, in the literal sense of the term, word than to call something an it. When I almost said it, when it is alive, when what we're referring to is this nexus of relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, you start to lose the its, don't you? You get a lot more theys. Lots of thems, not as many its. And yeah, that is something my whole family, I think, there's a lot of thems and not a lot of its. And that's a really beautiful thing to have been gifted growing up the way I did. And it was with lots of things. I mean, I gave farming as an example with my grandpa, but I mean, all of us have had gardens and we all have that way about everything. But cooking, and making things and just all of it. I think we imbue a lot of them and they in what I think a lot of other more contemporary folks might think of as an it. My dad's very handy, and I grew up. He was like an HVAC technician. He's so much more. I mean, like that's so silly. That's like saying I don't know.
One of the things he did,
like FDR was a politician. Like it's just he did a lot, and so even with him, it was like he understood the temperament of things. He could dance with them, and he made things. So when I was a kid, a lot of my stuff, I had a handmade desk, I had handmade toy box, and all of these things in our house were like made or repaired or created by my parents. It's really hard to think of things like that purely as like an it or a cold unconnected thing because it's so much of them in it. Like it's just so filled with like love and humanity. And so, I do tend to imbue a lot of the things around me with like that humanness.
The ness or the hyphen-ness in general of something. I'm still I'm still revisiting what you said about your grandfather and the how he chose to interact with his world, what he did, and there's something that I'm trying to touch on that I can't get to, but I hope we do later. Just it feels like a different way of relating to the world, and it's not so. I say that because I love reading about indigenous cultures, about different ways of perceiving, understanding reality, and how that's some of it has changed over generations, geographies, and how some of it there seems to be some sort of perennialism, or at least like the different angles of I don't know of how many sided figure trying to describe something similar. And what you described there seems to embody at least part of that.
It's a hard thing to grasp. I mean, my family is not, to clarify too, not indigenous. You know, poor white folk from the Appalachians mostly. But I think that what they had that might be sort of similar to what you see in other indigenous cultures, in indigenous cultures, I should say. It's like a non-hierarchical thinking. They're not trying to control the earth. They're not trying to like command it, which I think sometimes when you think of cultivation and agriculture, it's about. I recently, so this gets to it for me. I recently was at a gardening course and they were talking about growing something that's like non-native. I'm in Minnesota, so most things are there's a lot of non-native things. Um, and it was like, oh, you can do it, but you need to have this tent and these vents and these lights and these timers and these watering. And I thought, I hate everything about that. And all I could say when I got home was like, you have to trick the plant. I hate that. You had to trick the plant to grow. And something about me, like, no offense to anybody who gardens like that. It's amazing. Like, it's such a cool use of technology, but like, instinctually, it rubbed me so the wrong way to be dishonest with the plant somehow, to be disingenuous. And I know that probably to a lot of people are like, she's crazy. That's silly. But like, that was the feeling. And so I was brought up, my grandfather was never disingenuous, even though he was a farmer and he did this for trade. His life, his lifestyle depended upon it, and his livelihood depended on it. He wouldn't trick the plants. He wouldn't have tricked the livestock. He respected them, and it was like again, not a him on top of them. They didn't like cower to him. Honestly, I mean, even with things like horses and dogs and animals that you usually kind of need to train, or even break, some people will say break. I hate that term, but like, I don't remember him ever having to do that. Like, he could just sort of communicate and like let a thing be, and they could kind of coexist in a way that worked for both of them. And his dogs and pets and animals around him like were incredibly, like, you could tell they loved him too. Like, it was all very collaborative. So I think, to me, the difference between what a lot of times we'll think of, particularly in farming, but in lots of things, is like this weird hierarchy where we think we're like above and need to control or manage things that we have absolutely no idea how to control or manage and have no business doing. And I really loved that, not just my grandpa, like my whole family really comes to the natural world in a very non-hierarchical way, whatever it may be where they are.
When you describe the idea of not tricking nature, it's and not being one who's inclined to do so either. There's something about, well, we've learned our lessons about that, or we don't have the capacity to trick it. And the example that comes up for me regularly for this, and I, I'm assuming that my time farming helped me see this before. It probably wouldn't have been available to me otherwise. I flew to Mexico for a friend's birthday party several years ago. And as we were landing in to the airport or approaching the airport, I saw that most of the houses had this on top of their roof, they had these additional four walls, but no roof on top. And I assumed that was for two reasons. One, it was shade and an area for the heat to rise and escape and not get trapped in, and also maybe some bit of a wind tunnel, some place to stay when it was so hot. And there is this awareness of here are buildings that are fundamentally built with the landscape in mind. And I contrasted that with, well, here I am leaving in the winter, which is, in the mountains, it's quite chilly. We rely on external heat. Here in the summer, we rely on external cooling. So the idea of here, or contrast, especially with New York City, we can pipe in all the energy we need to do with it what we want. And that allows us to create a design of something, or to create something that has a design that is not attuned to its environment. The heat and cooling, or effectively the cooling that those Mexican homes relied on, was about the more they could work with the landscape and its idiosyncrasies to cool themselves. So their home was inextricable from, whereas so much of our maybe more local architecture is isolated. It is discrete. And therefore we have to, and it in it being discrete, we have to pipe in so much more, much like those plants. Like, yes, you can grow this, but you have to create these environments to do things for them that they would require. So you become an extension of the necessary environment through which they co-evolved and would co-emerge.
I feel like when you talk about it, and even like the heating and cooling is such a great context for it. When you build something that is discrete, like wholly discrete from the nature around it, you sort of start a fight a little bit where you're now constantly defending against it as well. And it comes back to that idea of compromise and collaboration, because in a Mexican home, are you perfectly cooled to 65 degrees at all
Mm.
times? No, probably not. Can you get by? Are you comfortable enough? Yeah. And and you're able to do so in concert with the things around you. I think when we either come into the architecture or just anything in that hierarchy sense of like our needs come first, and they are sacrosanct, and they are concrete, and they are not to be negotiated. You create that, but you're picking a fight with your landscape at that point and saying, I'm taking what you need completely out of the picture, and I'm focusing solely on what I need, nothing to do with you. And I think that that is something that's hard for me because for a lot of reasons. I mean, part you could call me like a dirty hippie, that's fine. But I think a lot of it comes down to like long game, short game, and energy efficiency. Like not just energy efficiency in the way that we think of it, like, electricity. I'm talking about your just mental energy and your life energy, like constantly having to slice out a budget of your energy as a person to defend this little castle that you've decided to create against your landscape or where you are. It is rough. I think it's why I really enjoyed. Like I said, I grew up in the North Central Valley. It's very hot. It's very cultivated. People have a deep respect for the land, but it's cultivated, and it, as a result, is tough. It's an uncomfortable place to live in the summertime, and everything is for is for the industry. Everything's for the almonds where I'm from, and so the air gets really gross because they're shaking the almond trees to get as much as they can, and so it's like a constant fight back and forth, and like the hierarchy is almost kind of like industry, people, nature, and I like where I live here. It's just kind of more blended, and things are a little bit like we don't need to run our AC at full blast because we're surrounded by trees. The house is naturally kept cool because we live in like a wooded area. And, Minnesota, I noted we're having a lot of rains. It's a very high flood year for Minnesota. But at least where I am, outside of the Twin Cities, they actually have been very good about maintaining their natural wetland. In most places, certainly there's places that where the cities are, and those are the places that flood. those are the places that struggle. Whereas where the wetlands have been left alone and the city starts a little bit ways back, everything's fine. The wetlands handle it. That's what they're there to do. They're there to take the runoff. They're there to help. And in many ways, where I live, the part of the Twin Cities, we're surrounded by lots of wetland. So we haven't had to fight nature on that. It's worked out fine. And so it's always very fascinating to me, like where you find places that have a little bit more of that compromised kind of built in and places that don't. And it's tough. It's a tough thing to do, like too, on your own. Unless you're gonna go completely off grid, it's hard to like say you're gonna live in perfect commune with nature. But I think there's lots of little ways to find it.
There's something you described about the idea of working with nature or creating something modern on top of it that I think ties into also our relationship to thoughts, emotion, and I think there's like a therapeutic aspect. Like I think of therapy as these verbal discussions to help us process things that are nonverbal, these emotional aspects. And if we view ourselves as being capable of being completely logical, and we overlook that we are emotionally guided and then we rationalize logically thereafter, like the logical processing comes much later. This intuitive, these aha moments, these intuitive understandings, gut feelings, yes, and then afterwards we process it logically, and we could override some of it for sure. But there's you can have a therapeutic intervention or therapeutic interaction that is divorced from the very long chain of evolutionary developments within us that are still occurring, and the environments from which we emerge and through which we co-emerged. Or you can have one that's it's a little bit more integrated. And so I think of some therapeutic discussions as like, hey, let's use words. We're going to use these very modern cognitive processes and the metacognition, so our cultural layer on top of that, to guide the flow of emotions. And I have the words are these flimsy materials, and our words are the flimsy materials, and we're trying to redirect the strong current of emotions and think like, oh, that's going to be enough. How do you I realize that you're not in the therapeutic world, and so this is me trying to understand this from the neuroscience perspective of what do you see in that type of interaction that it seems like something is missing from that first version, where it's not a relationship with our entire selves that we're approaching.
Yeah, well, I think we do something really similar in ourselves, in cultivating ourselves, in that we have this like ideal that we need to be, and it's told to us through whatever. And anything else is non-negotiable. So you have so much distress from not being what you should be, what you expect to be. It's kind of like being like, I want to live in Phoenix, but I want to be comfortably 64 degrees all the time. Okay. I mean, maybe you can achieve that with a lot of, you'll need a lot more than the words, but you'll have to, but you're going to have to, again, dedicate such a slice of your personal energy to defending that unnatural state for so long, like, and all the time. And it's just always there. I think oftentimes for ourselves, there's a lot of that. Like, there's certainly things that can be improved and learned, but I often think we're doing that to some external standard and not to the flows and the natural rhythms that we already have, our own nature. We have a nature. Of course, we need to be able to live peacefully with the people around us too. So you've got like the nature of people, the nature of society, and you need to be able to flow with that. You don't want to build the castle in the same way that we do in our physical places that we live. And I don't I think we have such still we're coming out of such a prescriptive era of psychology and psychiatry. Again, why I hate the DSM. Yeah, there are natural states of being that may not be, nothing is permanent anyway. When you're a human being, you're always flowing, changing, you always have infinite capacity for change. You do it whether you do nothing at all. That every moment you're different than you were the last. And we have such static ideas about mental health. What is a healthy individual? What is a healthy brain? Certainly, there are things that are objectively unhealthy, structural damage, dementias and things like that. But so much of how we function It might not be perfect, but it's functional. It's you, it's who you are. And learning to live in flow with that as opposed to trying to change it, I think is so critically important in a good therapeutic relationship. Somebody that can help you to find those flows that are coming up against the dam and you're struggling to keep the floodwaters back. And it's like, well, why do they need to flow? Like maybe we need to let them flow a little bit. What else can we do? We can't just stop it. And I think when you get down to the heart of a lot of that, it's because, oh, well, I need to be like this. I need to be like that. I need to do this. I need to do that. And I mean, so much of that is shoulds and not necessarily important. So I think that, yeah, therapeutically, there's a lot to be said about we're coming out of this sort of hierarchical, this is good and this is a little less good and this is not as good and this is bad. And we really, I think, need to kind of like make sure we take that hierarchy out and take out a lot of these like just black and whites in things that it has no business being in. Quit overdiagnosing the human condition and pathologizing normal things. You know, yes, there is a mean. Yes, there is a median. Yes, there is a mode. But everyone is an individual data point. Nobody is the median. Nobody is the mode. Nobody, you may reflect it, but you are not it. And all of the things that we have in broad scale mental health are regressions on central tendencies. And so you have to accept that, yes, that would probably, whatever the central tendencies are for the circle that you're in, the more you reflect those, yeah, you'll have an easier time. But only if that's what you actually reflect. Trying to change your data point to match the central tendencies, that's just going to wear you out and make you feel crappy. So I'm much more of a proponent of like, try and find your circle, like, go and try and find your central tendencies for the things that just simply don't seem to be things you can account for, things that make you feel good, but you feel like you have to control. Something's going on, and maybe find your circles. But again, not a therapist, but I tend to be more of be a bit nomadic. Feel free to like kind of get out of maybe the problem is your comfort zone, not you. And so, kind of seeing what other options are out there. There may be a whole functional part of society that does things the way you wish you could do them. You just don't know about it yet.
Speaking of central tendencies and becoming more fully yourself rather than regressing to any particular mean, that is inextricable from playfulness. So where are you
Yeah.
prone to being silly or making a bit of mischief?
I mean, I'm sure that's not hard to guess. I'm probably a bit of an outlier in that space, but and that's, maybe you'd be a very good therapist, Mick, because I'm now realizing all the things I'm saying. I'm like just talking about myself, huh? When I first decided I wanted to do what I wanted to, I wanted to be a scientist pretty early on. I loved the mind, and I knew I wanted to know everything about it when I was in the 10th grade, and I first read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I was fascinated by this person who saw the world so fundamentally off. I mean, different, but still more correct than some of the mentally healthy people in the story, right? For those who have not read
No
One Flew Over the
spoilers.
Cuckoo's
It's not
Nest.
100 years old yet.
No spoilers. No spoilers, but you should definitely read it. So I knew I wanted that. And then I knew I wanted to be a scientist. Gosh, some about sophomore years. I think it was my second year of undergrad that my research mentor sort of pulled me aside and was like, you need to work in a neuroscience lab. You will love it. And I did. But it became clear. My first research mentor was very quirky. I loved him. He let me be quirky. He actually probably just didn't even notice that I was quirky. It just didn't even register for the man. He just saw that I really had a natural aptitude for something and kind of a passion for it. And he was just like, yes, you. I don't really care about anything else. Like, I think he found it amusing. I was always like bebopping and like happy and playful. I think he enjoyed that I brought that to the lab. But on the whole, he wasn't the kind of person that probably even noticed that I was a little off. All of my favorite teachers and mentors when I was younger were the people like embraced and let me be playful and like knew it was harmless. And the people I really had a hard time with and like really clashed with were the ones who wanted me to be professional, be adult, be serious. Like, you're not going to ever be taken seriously if you do that or you act like that. And I never let that affect my love of it. I'm very through no doing of my own, the universe like made me rebel against that instead of accepting it, which I'm very happy for. And it's gotten me into so much trouble. Like, I've shown up to oh gosh, like I I once, when I was in grad school, so I have a forensic psychology background, I was really into trauma and both physical trauma and psychological trauma and the effects on the brain. And I was able to really study that in my lab that I was at in Fresno, by working with the forensic psychology department. They, of course, worked often with the police. So I did a lot of my early internships with like police and prisons and things like that. Well, I also played on the local roller derby team. And I remember one time our roller derby team was asked by the police department if we would come and make an appearance at their annual fundraiser. It was like a big event. They wanted us to like skate around and just kind of like talk to people about roller derby. And we were like living decorations. It was just like a novel thing to have at this event. And we were all just like fine. We were happy to do it. So we showed up in like our crazy roller derby outfits. I had like a big mohawk, this big blue mohawk, and my hair was in, and of course got my skates. I'm pretty tall already. So I mean, with a mohawk and skates, I'm like 6'6", coming through the door, wearing like my fishnets and like my chains and my roller derby jersey. And I come in, and my research mentor and his wife, who was the dean of my grad school, are sitting there. I didn't even think that they'd probably be like, I just was not like even thinking, oh my gosh. And I realized like the police officers like that I worked with at my internship and all these people I knew were there. And at first I'm like, oh well, like who cares? Like, they obviously don't have a problem with roller derby. They would never have had us come to this event. My program dean disagreed strongly. She was so upset with me and like made me go home immediately. And she was just like, these people will never respect you if they see you like this. And so I was like super embarrassed. But then afterwards, I thought about it and I'm like, they asked us to come. Like, they invited us and they asked us to be, and all the police officer people that were there, for the most part, it was all in good fun. They thought it was hilarious. Like, they knew I did roller derby because I would talk about it every once in a while at work, and they thought it was so fun to like see me in all of my garb and see all the girls. And they asked a lot about the bouts and stuff. It was fine, but I felt for her. Like, that did not really. It doesn't upset me in the same way that some of the other stories I was telling you about do, because I could tell for her, she was a woman. She had come up in a very different time than me. And I don't doubt that that was very true for her. Like, she probably had a much harder time. She had to kind of be like a man to get where she wanted to be. I'm very grateful that I've been able to be playful, embrace playfulness, embrace my quirkiness, and still get where I wanted to go. I find that I go to the circles that appreciate it, because those are the people I'm going to resonate with anyway. If people are super serious and buttoned up and they are really turned off by the playfulness aspect, I'm not going to thrive in that environment anyway. It's not for me. It's not my circle. It's not my central tendency. So it's a respectful thing. I don't think they need to change, but I don't think I need to change either. And it's just a matter of making sure I'm in a place where I can sort of let my weirdo flag fly. So, yeah, I'm a big fan. I think playfulness in general is actually, talk about a bias, I think it's incredibly healthy. Like, I think that there's research that suggests that it's very healthy. We like to kind of jam it into this box of it's healthy, but only for kids. And that's not true. It's healthy and very functional for humans throughout your life. You need to have fun. You need to be playful. You need to find the joy in things. And we just don't do that enough. We try to take ourselves so seriously. I don't know who came up with that, but I'm not a fan. I don't know who started that trend, but I'm not sending them a thank you card anytime soon. I'm not on Team Serious.
You mentioned teachers, professors who tacitly, semi actively, inadvertently supported your quirkiness and playful nature. Maybe a little bit before that, I'm curious about when someone saw something in you that you didn't see enough of or at all in yourself.
I 100% can tell you because it was incredibly important to me. And I think it was nothing to him. And that is crazy. I've sent him so many letters and emails, and I hope he knows it. As a kid, I knew I was pretty good at school, quick, and then I could learn things quickly. But I was also silly, and I don't know, just kind of, I wanted to be the best at school because it was a thing to be best at. But I felt like I didn't have a whole lot of understanding of where I wanted to go when I was fairly young. I always would think I'd wanted to be a doctor because doctors were successful. It's like a paragon of success when you're an 8-year-old kid. And I was in school. This was my freshman year of high school. I was in my science class, and um, I had this teacher, Mr. Cornwall. I'll say his name because he was so important. And he was just very dry. He taught like all the physical sciences, and he had this very dry humor, like very kind of like ironic. And he wouldn't be overt about it. Like he would make a joke, and a lot of people wouldn't even realize it was a joke. And when you did, it was even funnier because you realized how sarcastic, like, and fabulous it was. I always like really dug him. Like he just like had this energy that kind of made me like he didn't need you to laugh at his jokes. Like he just kind of was himself. And I respected him because he taught the smart science that I knew I was really bad at, like chemistry and physics and all these things that I always struggled with. So I just assumed he thought I was dumb because I wasn't good at those things. And out of nowhere, just apropos of nothing, he came up to me one day while I was working, and I think it was chemistry was the thing I'd taken, and I was working on something, and he goes, "You know what, Bethany? You're going to do really good in college. You're really going to thrive." He's like, "You might struggle in high school. Don't let that like get you down. You're like really going to do well in college. It's going to be for you." And just carried on, like kept walking and like with his day. And that was up until that point. Like a lot of times when I had like more serious or like, and particularly male teachers, they were kind of not great about encouraging me. It was a lot of, particularly like those kind of like smart teachers. I wasn't serious enough, and they got frustrated with me. Like, you're not going to succeed because you don't take anything seriously. And here's this guy who's like teaching the hardest class I've ever taken, and he's like the smartest teacher I've had, and he's super serious ish, dry, not really serious. And for him to just say that and just say it because it clearly just came to his mind. He wasn't trying to like butter me up or make me feel better. I wasn't like crying or having a bad day. It was just like something that occurred to him. So he said it out loud to me. It was one of the first times I had somebody like that kind of more, um, I don't know, that flavor of teacher, that flavor of person. I'd had a lot of my female teachers and women. I had never had it from somebody like him. And it was really kind of life changing. This idea that maybe there is a world out there. And that kind of got me thinking, like, not everybody's like this. There's a world out there where I might thrive. And it really gave me a lot of optimism. It made me feel really good about like who I was. I could take a lot of pride in the things that I did differently as opposed to being like ashamed or feeling like there were weaknesses. And he just, a big part of the reason was able to do what I did in my life and to do it joyfully and authentically was literally because of that one comment that he just decided to make out of like just the kindness of his heart, like just to say it and walk off like it was nothing, and it was like everything to me. So I'm eternally grateful for that moment in my life. It was a huge moment for me.
It's incredible of realizing the many sides of you and the environments you have yet to be in that might be more welcoming.
Yeah, the idea that I might not have to change who I am and thrive just because I changed where I was. That had never occurred to me. Why would it? As a kid, you don't have the power to change where you are
And we're
for the
back
most
to the
part.
plants and the houses.
And yeah. And so yeah, it was amazing, and it changed my whole life philosophy.
I'm curious about how the many sides of you work together and how they clash. Like, what sort of conflict have you had between being yourself and belonging?
Oh gosh. Um I mean, I still struggle that I'm not like Gwen Stefani 1994 Tragic Kingdom cool all the time. Like I'm still very self-conscious about like how uncool I fundamentally feel like I am most of the time, or like how loud I am, how non-feminine I tend to be. I'm not very ladylike, and all of these things. And so I struggle with them. I try to embrace them for who I am. Oh, with the moment that somebody like teases me for them, I like break inside. Like when people are just like, God, you're so loud. Can you just be quiet? I'm like, oh, I died. Like I died a death. And I hope nobody saw my soul leave my body. Um, so I'm definitely working on both balancing those things, because I can't just be constant loud thunderbolt in places all the time, but also just embracing like it's okay to be like, you forget to be quiet in quiet places. That doesn't make you a bad person. Like it's all right. But I definitely have my own parts of myself that, while I love them sometimes, I hate them sometimes. So it's figuring out like the times and the places, I guess, for certain things. But for the most part, I'm gonna be 40 this year. And I feel like in the last 10 years of my life, like my 30s were really about getting comfortable in my own skin and really letting go of the need to like change a lot for things that I don't feel like I'm changing in response to like, there's something about meeting somebody in the middle, changing because you're collaborating. And I'm very fine with that. And then there's changing who you are because it just makes somebody uncomfortable and they don't want to
Mhm.
deal with it. And that I'm not okay with. So I think my 30s were all about noticing the difference between what those things are, not constantly rebelling, but not constantly kowtowing, and really finding the line. Still working on it, but I've gotten better.
I like to regularly remind myself that I'm a primate and I evolved in a group, as you know, we do within the overlap of many different types of relationships and temperaments. And one of the things I like to think about is especially the notion of playing to strengths and the amount of energy we have to expend on not when we don't. And I think of it as the relationships that we rely on to balance or complement us, that our strength is a strength if and when it's around others who complement that.
Yeah.
And that allows us to lean in more into those elements, and those who specialize in something else, or those who generalize in something else, uh, are able to embrace that as well. And I'm curious about how have the relationships around you that through which you found balance and complementarity helped you be more yourself. And maybe there's some that are missing, and so maybe that's part of that as well.
No, I think I'm going through a big lesson on that right now. My husband and I have been together. We just for 5 years, and it's a time of reflection for us both. And one thing that I really love, he's very different than me in so many ways. He's very organized and routinized, and he's very calm, and he's very like thoughtful with his words. He'll get excited and then he gets really chatty, which is like one of my favorite times. Whenever he's just so excited about something, he'll just talk about it. Usually it's like amplifiers and guitars or like poker strategies. He gets so excited about all these things. I'm just like, I can follow the amplifier discussion. He loses me on most of everything else. But I love his enthusiasm, so I'll always love to listen to it. But for the most part, he's very different, but in a way that I feel complimented by, not like I'm stepping on. And that's something I've had to really work with myself on, because he is so different and he is so lovely, because he will constantly reinforce, like, I love how you're different. Be different. Like, don't be me. Be different. You're not bothering me by being different. And that's not always in my relationships with people, like romantic relationships. That's not really how I felt about it. It was like, I love you even though you're like this, right? Like it's not, I love you because you're like this. And he's the first person who's really been very good about like vocalizing that with me all the time. And so we can just be like, we can just be separate, but together. And when we're together, it's because it improves like it improves upon the silence kind of a thing, like it's not like we need to complete each other. We complement each other. I really love that. And it's helped me to understand how it's okay to just kind of like, we both need to be singular functional people. If something happened, I had to move across the country, I need to be able to function. But it's also really nice to have a person that like it feels like when we do come together, it's very complementary and balancing. And so I love that. But it's been a lot of personal development of like getting comfortable with that and understanding that it's okay. Because so often in my life, I've been more confronted with people who were different than me that found my differentness annoying or off putting. To have somebody who finds my differentness like lovely is a very different change, but a positive one.
I'm curious about the ways in which, given where you've grown up, given the culture that you were raised in and around, and also the one you found yourself in academically and professionally, in what ways have you embraced continuity with your culture, and how have you found it stifling and you've bucked against it?
Well, I would say that I do always tend to find folks when I'm in an unfamiliar setting or a new setting that sort of remind me of home. So people who are just a little bit more, I don't know, grounded. I oftentimes find myself sort of attracted to in a new kind of situation, particularly those that are more like intellectual or academic, where I know that I'm going to be trying to find my footing culturally a little bit. I think that that was something that came in really handy in grad school. Like one of my very best friends I met in grad school, she was from North Carolina and came from more of just kind of again a grounded background like myself. We came from a more like a less naturally academic or kind of intellectually centered family situation. So I think that we understood each other, and that was lovely. And I think we reminded each other of home. She was always really upset because she said for the longest time I made the best macaroni and cheese she had ever had, and she was very angry that the best macaroni and cheese that she had ever had came from her friend that lived in California when she was Southern. She thought that was unholy, and I took it as a great compliment. Yeah, so I do tend to naturally attune to folks who I come to realize are people who just make me feel a little bit more in touch with my home, my family, my culture. It does come into, so I am, I find it very interesting. It's sort of a paradox. I've always gotten the impression of my family as being fairly nomadic. Um, they came over during the Dust Bowl to California, so not super long ago, and they were the kind of folks who didn't really like own farms per se. They worked farms, so had a very kind of seasonally nomadic kind of vibe to them. But my immediate family, that was not so much the case. So my grandparents, my parents, myself, they are all in California. They're still in California, but I am very nomadic, and so I've lived in lots of different places by the nature of just my personality and my work, and I do enjoy living in different places and just tasting different places. Um, as a result, I think I tend to be a little bit more open-minded sometimes than some of my other family. Not so much my parents and my brother, even though they don't necessarily share my joy of jumping around everywhere. They are open-minded people. I mean, I told you about my mom, so it's not like they were naturally conservative folks to begin with. But my, kind of extended family, I love them all and I love the people that they are, but the way we see the world is often fundamentally pretty different just because they have ideas of things. And unfortunately, I think in the world we live in now, otherness is becoming sort of villainized for a lot of folks. And so their otherness exposure is very curated in a way that makes others seem like villains or some kind of, you know, rival or like a threat. I tend to get my sense of otherness from literal others and being out with people who are different and being in places that I might not be naturally as comfortable in, but just getting to know people. And so I have a hard time with like villainizing otherness because everybody's just trying to do their best for the vast majority of cases. And so when it comes to things like that, I do sometimes get disappointed. Like, I think that I wish that they could see for themselves and feel for themselves um, that otherness is nothing to be threatened by. But it's not terrible. I've seen much, much worse. And considering my upbringing and my family's cultures, I think that it could have been much worse. I think that my parents and my aunts and uncles sensed that and tended to rebel against it instead of feeding into it. So there's a lot of cultures that have been brought into my family through marriage, which I love because it kind of forced the otherness to become us-ness. And so there's been a lot of really cool. Um, I am not the only one who feels the way I do about that sense of otherness is not always wrong. And so I am grateful for that. But it is always just kind of something. And I think in grounded cultures, unfortunately, there's a tendency towards conservatism. And lately, that's been really exploited by mass media and culture more broadly, kind of like commercial culture. And I hate that. So something that I try my best to figure out how to navigate, but it's a bummer.
I like how you phrased otherness into usness.
It's pretty tough whenever all of a sudden, like, you can't really say that they're other when they're, around the table at Thanksgiving. There's not a lot you can do with that. I love it. It's like radical usness.
I like to refer to everything as the many sides of we. And so rather than saying us versus them, I
Mm,
say those of us who and those of us who that. Because it's still, there's
yeah.
a unity there, underlying unity, even within superficial divisiveness. I think you alluded to this. I'm curious whether by family or by travel or general exposure, in meeting other cultures, what have you incorporated into your own life?
Oh gosh. Well, I grew up in, again, like the Central Valley, so that is a melting pot. It is not a singular. Its culture is multicultural. So it's predominantly, um, what you would expect, California folks, but a very healthy influx of Central American, predominantly Mexican, to where you grow up speaking Spanglish. You've got the horchatas man, not necessarily the ice cream truck. We had both, but you understand things. You have foods and language and words. Um, I called them chanclas. I'll call them chanclas 1,000 times before I'll think to call them a sandal. And um, you've got just a lot of that. I think it's really cool, like this sharing of culture around the edges. Um, and so I really loved that, and that was something that was really, really fascinating. But it also taught me late in life to be mindful of folks who like find pride in keeping their culture a little bit closer to the vest, and understanding, like, I certainly have no problem with that. It's just new. Back at home, I was always surrounded by, in California, I think it's a cultural thing to be very free and very inviting with your culture. I think that's just something we have on the West Coast that's maybe a little unique to us. There's not a lot of dividing lines a lot of the time. It's a lot more of like an enthusiasm for sharing as opposed to blocking off. That to that being said, there's places where that's not the case, and there's good reason for it, and there doesn't need to really be a reason for it. Your culture is your culture. How you treat it is how you treat it. But it's been interesting to me living in other places where my lack of um I don't know what I would call it, um intimidation, or I don't have a lot of fear around new cultures. I find them really cool and fascinating and exciting, and I don't feel terribly uncomfortable when I'm in a like a what you would traditionally think of as a culture, right? Like people's like national cultures. And that's something that I noticed when I moved away from California was unusual to people in other places, but something they usually came to realize. I meant no harm, but I try to be mindful of it now that like that's not always the case. So to making sure I'm not making unintentionally making people feel like uncomfortable or like trampled on. So I moved to Alabama for my postdoc. Moved from Sacramento to Alabama. That was a big shift culturally for me, and it's different there. There's a little bit less of that, like, let's share my culture, right? Like it's a little bit more close to the vest. It's a little more personal. And when I had like all of these kind of weird cultural flavors, and my family is also very multicultural. I have family who's Persian, I have family who's Mexican, I have family who's Portuguese. So I just grew up with a lot of these things that kind of, you know, I'm ivory white, but I have like a lot of background of places that people don't expect. And it just pops out randomly, and I don't think of it as being jarring. And so down there, it would kind of throw people off, and they'd feel a little weird, or I could tell they would feel a little bit like nervous about having somebody at like a particularly intimately cultural thing. People in the South are pretty warm. So it didn't happen quite as often down there. In Minnesota, I find it happens quite a lot more. People up here are much more closed off with their culture, and that's something I'm getting used to. It's just private. They're private people up here, and I'm fascinated, as always, by why. Like, does it have to do with the cold and like having to like make sure your family has a place to like be and like be together? You can't just like let everybody in. Like, you have like limited resources over this like harsh winter. Like, what it is that makes people a little more. They're not unkind. They're just a little bit cold. Like when it comes to a line, like there's a friendly line, there's like a stranger line where they'll be like chatty and friendly, and everybody talks about Minnesota nice, but there's very much a line of like the culture where you are not to cross. Like, this is us now, this is ours. Like in California and Alabama, being somebody who lived on my own for a while, there is not a time where you're not going to be invited home if you're there for Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever it may be. A family is bringing you in. Like, it's just going to happen. I've never had that in Minnesota. Like, they would, like, unless you are married in or like part of the family, I have never had a family that was comfortable letting like strangers come into like a family dinner. Again, nothing judgmental. It is different though. And I had to kind of realize that that was just kind of a cultural thing. They just weren't eager to share that with people, and in the same way that a lot of other places had been. So yeah, it was really, I guess now I've been exposed to even the culture of not wanting to expose you to culture. And I'm learning how to do that like as gracefully as possible, not accidentally like crossing any lines.
In the theme of seeing things from different perspectives and trying to find this unifying whole, you mentioned earlier the inspiration or the allure of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And you mentioned that you were involved with forensic psychology, which I think is, this may be a very naive perspective, that it's somewhat adjacent to abnormal psychology and that the types of people you might end up studying. And so were you drawn to that space?
Oh yeah. Yeah. When I first started, I was very drawn to abnormal psychology. And as I became more, um, I guess, more well rounded in my studies, I kind of realized there was no normal psychology. So it was really hard for me to understand how there could be abnormal psychology. So I kind of drifted from it a little bit in that way, realizing that abnormal is still normal in so many ways. And that kind of, I noticed, intrigued me more. Why? Like, why would a brain that is otherwise normal do this thing that we think is weird or different? I was very fascinated by schizophrenia for a long time. I thought that was such a fascinating condition. I felt terrible for the people who experienced it because I saw it a lot. So you see a lot of psychotic disorders in forensic psychology as well. Very common. Not always schizophrenia, although sometimes it is. There's also like drug-induced psychoses and things like that. And people who can't draw a line between reality and unreal like reality, that's so terrifying. You kind of lose like this natural anchor that I think a lot of people just kind of take for granted, and your perceptions and what other people can see and you can't. And it broke my heart, but it also intrigued me. Like, what does make something real? Well, it's shared, I guess, but like there's things that we share that are totally different perspectives, but we still think of them as real. So like what makes that different? And that really, I think, just grew into my interest of perception, sensation and perception and more generally, and cognition and affect more generally. Not in the way, and what's funny because when I was a kid, I always kind of thought that that was like the boring stuff, learning how your eyes work, learning how your ears work. But then, like, when I learned about how they work once they get to your brain and all your sensory cortices, I was like, oh, wow, okay, like this is really cool. So, I like, if you're going to ask me about how like the optic nerve works, I'm probably going to have to pull up Google. But like, when you talk about how you process those signals and use them and add context to them, I get really intrigued. So a lot of my fascination for those things. Once I read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I proceeded to read every single book on schizophrenia that my school's library had, and I that is what drove me to want to do psychology. And then the concept of what is real and what isn't sort of drove me into neuroscience and what I do. So yeah, it was all kind of like an odd parade, but it had a sort of progression.
One of the unfortunate associations we have with abnormal psychology and mental disorders tends to be the religious delusions of grandeur.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
this may be a very strange way to enter this question. I'm curious about your relationship with the sacred.
Ooh, I love that. Well, I grew up, I mean, it's probably unsurprising. I grew up in a pretty uh, traditional sort of. My family had a lot of elements of Southern Baptist, but they were technically non denominational Christianity. But a lot of while our churches weren't necessarily Southern Baptist, a lot of our beliefs were. Not as harshly, but definitely the echo of them were always there. I was fascinated by religion as a kid because it was just a big part of my family and it seemed so important. Like it was meant to be like this idea of if you don't do this, you'll go to hell. And so I, was intrigued. Like every kid, I think I liked the stories, but I started to like really at first my first issues with traditional religion, kind of came from this idea of like, isn't heaven really crowded? how how would they have enough space for everybody that would be there? Like that seems like it would be uncomfortable. And if it's uncomfortable, then it's not perfect. So like, how does that work? Little kid thoughts, of course. But as I started getting older and understanding that like not everything is good and bad, it was really hard for me to maintain the religion I was sort of raised with. I still find aspects of Christianity interesting. And I certainly think that I love that, like, we have any religious text, not just the Bible, but anybody's religious text is this like series of stories that we've used to preserve our history. And for that, I think it's kind of beautiful and fascinating, no matter what the text may be. Our ability to use metaphor and story to keep something alive forever is amazing. And so as I do enjoy kind of collecting and reading lots of different kind of religious texts and trying to think to myself what the actual events might have been based on the story and looking for like the similarities. So you know that something really big must have happened around the same time that everybody sort of perceived in their own way. But I have a very hard time with like judgment of good and bad. And so it's made it really hard for me to feel comfortable in a traditional sort of religion, but I definitely believe in the sacred. And so to me, the sacred is sort of the rhythm of those patterns. And I think that a lot of religions, and I guess I can only really speak to Christianity in this because of my own upbringing with it, it's just another metaphor for trying to understand this energy transfer that is so big and beautiful and awe-inspiring and so central to our lives, but way too big for us to put words to it. So we try to put words to it and we try to put stories to it. And then in the meantime, you've got folk wisdom And you've got things that have worked that people want to preserve because, hey, we found something that worked here. Let's make it a rule. But then unfortunately, you've got people who just want, we have an ugly tendency towards efficient mass production, the easiest way possible to the biggest growth possible. Like we have this kind of ugly streak as humans where we're always looking for that like easy money, you know? And I think that people have unfortunately taken this concept of like metaphor for complex things and just taken it at its very base, you know, words, those flimsy words that you talked about earlier. Like I find that too much of whenever you try to get involved with some of the religions I was brought up with, it's the flimsy words. I want the thing, the water, the energy, the flow that the words are trying to constrain or guide. And I get irritated when not nearly enough attention is paid to that because, and understandably so, how do you describe a thing that's so big and so ubiquitous and so awe inspiring that you don't even have words? Or it's like when I was trying to explain my intuition, I can't. And this is the same. So how are you going to sit in church and just stare at each other? Look at pictures of mountains and waterfalls. Like it would be tough. So there's a lot of things about I my relationship with the sacred is so much less structured. I don't like doctrine, I guess is the best way to think of it. I think doctrine is the words. I think it's man-made. It's our way of building up against nature. It's that castle again. And I just want to be out there and I want to see it flow. I've had some events in my life, right? Like it's particularly helpful for me around loss and grief. When I lose somebody, it was hard for me as a kid. I was not comforted by the idea of heaven because that person's still gone. And I didn't find that comfort like other people do. And I know a lot of people do. And I'm not meaning to demean that at all. Everybody's got a highly personal relationship with this. But for me, the idea that that energy, and it's not like the energy that we think of like as a soul for me. I think of the soul as like it's the energy between the neurons. Like it's that electricity that's lighting everything up. It's not the neurons. It's not the patterns of the neurons. Those are all structural things. Those are all things that die and degrade and go away. But the electricity that we don't understand, that doesn't make any sense, that's way stronger and seems to be self-sustaining in a way that physics, we just can't apply to it very well. That to me, that's the soul. And when you die, I like to think, I mean, it's energy transfer. You know, it doesn't start and it doesn't stop. It just flows. And now it's somewhere else. You know, it's in a new tree that's sprouting up. It's in the people around you. And it's like that sudden like boost when you need it. Like you're exhausted and you just need that last little thing and you always seem to find it. And I think that that's the energy from the transfer and it's just everywhere. They're everywhere with you. They're always with you. And everything's always with everything. To me, that's so much more profound and comforting and beautiful than anything I've ever read with like a religious doctrine, which always seems to try to have a hierarchy or some kind of power struggle. And I just like everything to flow. Like it just makes me feel so much more connected to other people and to the people who I've known and that are no longer here, people that haven't even been yet. So to me, it feels more right. So that's kind of where I live with it. But again, I respect that it's a big thing and it's hard to explain or understand without metaphor. And whatever metaphor makes sense for people, if it makes them happy and it's not hurting anybody, I'm always on board with what everybody's explanations are.
I like that you emphasize the use of metaphor there, and also that you ventured into the challenges, I guess, contemporary challenge. And I use the term contemporary now more loosely because I don't know when this shifted. Certainly, it's not uncommon for me to encounter folks who've struggled with their experiences because they were also raised in some sort of environments that were too literal, too, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's not literal, too superficial. That it was these are the rules, but not the depth.
Yeah.
And so often, I think that results in this the religion that's or the faith, the set of guiding philosophical beliefs that's most accessible to us then becomes semi-paradoxically the least accessible. And we actually have to use other
Yeah.
symbols to explore the same thing that might have been present in our local one, but because of that tension, we had to find it somewhere else. And the parallel I draw here is, and I know we've gushed in the past about Lisa Feldman Barrett, and for me, the notion of untranslatable foreign words is something that I've enjoyed so very much because it helps develop an emotional granularity. And I think there is a parallel here to
Yeah.
religious symbols that as we become more aware of more types of religions, which that is itself is a very contemporary thing, as we become more aware of other religions
Yeah.
and we're able to uh, explore them, at least peripherally, we're able to then get more depth in our own. And the reason I say it's such a contemporary
Yeah.
thing is what not too long ago, there was no separate ability to separate religion from culture. Where you were was where you lived, was who you
Yeah.
were, was what you believed. You can't try out another faith and still live within that culture.
Oh yeah.
And so
Yeah.
now we can, and also now we have a far more tenuous interaction with whatever, again, local faith we were in. I like to think of religious symbols in this way of you have a word available to you that isn't in your native
Mm.
language, but encapsulates or helps you to convey the thing you're trying to do so. And I'm curious if there's other symbols that you've either sought out or you've resonated with that are external to your culture and or your faith. And it could be from two directions, or at least two directions. One, because maybe your culture or your faith lacked it, or it didn't lack it, but you couldn't relate to it at home. You had to relate to it somewhere else first.
Oh. Oh, love it. Yes. Yes. And by the way, I think everyone, even if you are the most like religious person ever, the most devout person ever, I think a lot of us do this. But we don't think of it. But I mean, the first thing that I think most people are introduced to is the anthropomorphism of different kind of universal energies through like the traditional classical gods and goddesses, which you usually just learn in school, and they're not even considered religious anymore. They're just like these sort of cultural icons. It was one of the first times for me that I saw a religious icon, a power icon, like a god that was not male, that was female. Suddenly, there were these female, metaphors, and it wasn't about just doing what the men say, doing what you're supposed to do, keeping your head down, being quiet, which is what I was always sort of shown. But my in religion, in church, but not my mom or my grandma or my great grandmas. Like these, I come from a line of very strong women, and they, a lot of times, but they were also very devout in their faith. And I always thought that was really paradoxical for me. And it meant a lot to see, at least the first time, that there were these goddesses, and like women could be powerful, women could be worshipped too. Yes, I collect things all over the place. My house is an absolute abundance of like religious symbols that resonate with me. I love the Lady Guadalupe, mostly because she's this beautiful reminder of home. She always makes me feel like home, but she's also this just lovely, like it's nurturing energy, it's maternal energy. There's no culture I have found yet that like the Lady Guadalupe is not loved in her form or name or whatever she may be, and she doesn't represent like this true beautiful unconditional love. Like she to me is lovely. So Catholicism, particularly Mexican Catholicism, was very prominent where I grew up, but it wasn't the religion that I had. But we were always going to baptisms and weddings and funerals where that was the religion. So something that was pretty comfortable. That was an easy, pretty easy jump for me. But she was again like this symbol that was female and unapologetically female and powerful in her femaleness, and that meant a lot to me. Um, Recently I came across a very fascinating take that was the first time I had seen something that described like the women in my family. And it was from a website, I think it was a podcast, a woman who was a pagan who grew up Southern Baptist. So I'm like, okay. And she was talking about something called granny magic, and I had never heard of this before. And it's apparently something that like people who kind of follow more of these like pagan style, like neo-pagan um, rituals and religions uh, describe essentially the culture of women that I descended from. These women who were actually quite devout Christians. However, they carried this like they ritualized the use of herbal medicines. They used ritual in healing. They used kind of what I would have called growing up superstition, but is almost like spell work that you see in like indigenous or pagan religions and cultures. Yet at any time, if you ask somebody who's kind of engaging in this like granny magic, like, oh, are you doing magic? It's like, no, that's the devil. I'm not doing that. But wear this like this red rock in your right shoe for the next 3 days, and like your gout will be cured, right? Like so, I was like finally seeing something that resonated, and so that was really great. I don't know if that's quite a symbol per se, but like at least a label that kind of captured that paradox that I grew up with. And the reason why I think I struggled a lot with traditional Christianity being like so masculine and so hierarchical and so do what you're told. Because I said, I hate whenever you read through the Bible. Like I love reading the historical stories and I love the human stories of the Bible, but I absolutely despise that so often they'll be like, here are the new rules. Like, oh, we had rules before. And now here's like 5 or 10 or 20 new rules. Well, why do we need to do this? Like as the people inevitably say. And it's like, because I'm God. Because God told me so. That's like the answer in the Bible. Like 90, there's like 3 million verses that just essentially come down to like, because God told us so. And I always didn't like that. That is not an answer. As a child, as an adult, because the big person who has said they're in charge has said that you're supposed to, that does not resonate well with me. So like the Zeuses of the world and like that singular God of like, I've decided I'm in charge and I've also decided that these are the rules because I say so. That's never going to roll great with me. So exploring other religions that don't necessarily predicate on that have been very helpful.
How have you made rules at home and wherever you've been the chief?
Oh, the chief. I'm very bad at being the chief. I am bossy, but I am not a good boss. But I think the big rule in our family is the establishing and respecting of boundaries, and being mindful of that, and also just being thoughtful about who you are, what you say, what you do, doing things purposefully, and that's those are big rules for us. And I like it because they're rules that my husband and I also sort of have to work to learn and understand, not um you know demanding so much, but like demanding for ourselves, but not demanding on behalf of like because I said so. Because it crosses a line for me, like because that thing that you are doing crosses this boundary for me. And then having a discussion about like, where are we with that? Like, is this a compromise situation? Is it a non-compromise situation? um, I really take a lot from my husband on that because he's been a dad a lot longer than I've been a parent figure, and he's gotten very good at it. It's something that he just naturally was important to him. And I really, even in the most frustrating times, I've never heard him just say, because I told you so. And I really respect that. That's got to be hard. Like there are times where you just want to pull a Bible verse and just be like, because I say so. And he doesn't. He's really patient. And it's taught me to be more patient and turn it into an opportunity to learn. And I appreciate that. So, yeah, I think a big because I say so rule in our house is to never say because I say so, or just say because I say so. Like understanding um, why you have rules and what they do and how they help is bigger for us than the rules themselves.
And thinking about understanding rules, understanding others, what are the questions that you most enjoy asking others?
How do you see
Mm.
that? Like a thing that we can both see, or both, literally or hypothetically. How do you see that? When I was in college, my roommate that I mentioned earlier, we would I would always love to just we'd go on the tangent that every kid who takes a neuroscience class goes on at around that time is like, how do you know that what you see is red is what I
It's always the
see?
same color too. It's
And
always red.
it's always red. And then we played a game. It still brings me joy to think about this. I hope that she listens to this and it makes her smile. What color is the number 1 for you? And we would like both be like 1, 2, 3, red. Okay, what color is the number 3 for you? 1, 2, 3, yellow. And like we would just do this for like long stretches of time that was like kind of improbable, but we always said the same colors and we would always kind of laugh at it. And it was just like this like running joke for years. But the fact that like for whatever reason when we conjured up these like disparate things, we probably had the same Fisher Price
Oh, you've
toy,
been
you know, in the
primed.
80s or something.
You've been
What?
primed with.
Yes, like we probably just had the same. So like we both watched the same Sesame Street episodes or had the same toy or something, but we had these like obscure abstract things and they were the same. We always thought that was just absolutely wild. But yeah, I absolutely love to just hear what people are seeing when I can see it too and just understand how it's different. I think that's so cool. Whether it's a situation or a literal thing, I love the idea of like differing perceptions.
Now that you mentioned the Fisher Price set, I'm wondering, well, that wasn't synchronized synesthesia. That was, and could the could toys like Fisher Price gizmos actually cause some of those extra connections to fade away? I remember when I was younger, I would associate words, specific sounds and words, and there were connections I was making that seemed synesthetic in retrospect, but I lost that perhaps after emigrating.
Oh,
I remember just a
oh,
small number of connections, but I like that type of play, and just of course like this, Sunday means elephant, or no,
yeah.
Saturday means elephant, and Sunday means this type of sofa chair, but also Boris Yeltsin.
I love that. There were kids at the coffee shop yesterday when I was working who were arguing over whether Tuesday and Thursday were masculine and Monday, Wednesday, Friday were feminine or whether it was vice versa. I loved that. The teenagers that were like working in the shop were having this whole conversation. And I sat there trying not to eavesdrop, but I was like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday are clearly feminine and Tuesday and Thursday are clearly masculine. And like they were having like a whole and like they saw them totally differently. I love the idea though that you would have different approaches to that based on like your cultural origin, like that when you moved and changed so drastically like your environment around you that like it would change your synesthetic associations. Like yeah, I mean of course it would, because those are really just going to be unconscious pickups, associations you're getting from your environment through unconscious exposure to them. But your environment changes drastically, your unconscious exposures are of course going to change drastically right along with them. But I love that you were doing it with words. You would have enjoyed the conversation at the coffee
Now,
shop.
did it seem like these folks may have spoken languages that did in fact have gendered words?
They were all clearly like like just born and bred Minnesota
Huh.
kids. They were like happy corn-fed
Mm-hmm.
Minnesota kids. They were, from what I could sense, but I mean, the United States is incredibly gendered. So even though we don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily have gendered like L's and laws, I mean, I think we gender things all the time, but I am intrigued. I don't know why I think Tuesday and Thursday are particularly masculine and Monday, Wednesday, and Friday aren't, but I do. I definitely was like, that's excellent. That's an excellent point.
And what are the weekends?
I wanted to play along. I don't know. Asexual, agendered. I don't think of the, well, let me take, no, they do not have the same gender pull as the days of the week. How weird is that? They are like, they are above, and they are above gender, beyond it.
Can you tell me about a time where someone of any species expressed curiosity about you?
Huh. Of any, I love that you say of any species. Well, I think any non-human species always like gives me the impression that they look at us with a curiosity that sort of to me betrays a sense of like, what the hell are you doing? I live now in a place that has a lot of like little woodland creatures everywhere, chipmunks and squirrels and rabbits and sometimes deer. And they always seem curious, but they also always just seem a little bit like just yeah, little what's the word I'm looking for? Almost patronizing. I love it though. It makes me laugh. It keeps you humble whenever a squirrel looks at you like, what are you doing, man? As far as I find that kiddos are always very curious about me because I'm big, I'm loud, I'm colorful. I'm usually wearing like very bright prints, and I love that I could offer that, like that it intrigues them. That's something about like the idea that I would be intriguing to either a child or a person who has a good sense of like fun and a sense of humor is something that I like, and I do tend to see that people who see me in a crowd are usually people who are like also like a bit on the quirky side.
Quirky, creative, colorful. You know,
Yes.
we have this innate drive to create, whether it's order, relationships, meaning, art, tools. Can you introduce me to your imagination and creativity?
Oh, so I actually see myself. I get confused sometimes because I will be reading through media for like creatives, professional creatives, and I'm like, that's me. I'm a professional creative because I'm always thinking of ways we can apply science to the real world, and whether that's designing something or applying it or modifying it somehow. I see my job as a scientist, particularly because I'm a translational scientist. I do work in like R&D, as being absolutely unquestionably creative. And then I always laugh because I'll sign up for like a workshop or a seminar or like something, and then I'm like surrounded by people who are like visual artists, right? The digital graphic designers, and they all look at me like, why are you here? I'm like, well, I'm a creative too. So I definitely I love my work because it is so deeply entwined with my imagination. The fact that I can use my imagination makes me incredibly joyful, and it makes me feel incredibly connected to this like career path that I get to go down. So and it kind of comes back to what I was saying at the very beginning. We were talking about like what kinds of thoughts or things I don't love, and I always rush. I'm always like rushing to the next thing, feeling like I need to be like productive or something. And it's it's that just letting my imagination go. I realized, you know, yesterday I was like, I told you I had this idea, and my husband was kind of laughing because I was scribbling on my iPad because I was writing it down. But it started with this kernel of an idea that I had when I woke up. So it's probably like a dream I forgot about. But this idea of like how starting a new habit kind of feels like if you had to go on a journey through the woods, right? Like very like hero's journey. And I just thought like if this was a hero's journey, like what would it be? Like what would I do? How do I make it more fun? Because like I'm trying to do this thing and it feels like a chore. So let's turn it into a story. And by the end of it, I had this like whole story, this whole like idea of how you could turn it into like whether it's a video game or just a gamification, but like this whole mythology and world and like set of trials and triumphs and bosses and challenges. And I was writing it all down, but it was like, God, I got to like imagine that. And now that can go into my work. Like there's something I can do to make that into a thing that will actually make people feel better or do better. There's a way to do this. I haven't figured it out yet, but like the idea that I could just think about something so silly and what most people would just think of as like a waste of time, and actually think like that actually ties in, that could be something. And I loved that I could think about that all day. It felt really good.
How do your dreams influence your waking life, aside from this idea that came up for you?
Which may or may not have been a dream. I wish I was one of those people that was really good at remembering my dreams, and it may seem misaligned with like how kind of just weird and intuitive I tend to be with things, but I'm kind of not great at remembering my dreams. I always am trying to get better, but every once in a while one will sneak through. My dreams are incredibly helpful. Like, thank you, brain, because they'll do things like solve a very clear problem. Like I will always remember I had a dream once. I was working in SQL, which probably dates the story already, but I was like trying to pull data from this very unruly set of databases that didn't want to play nicely together. They were all SQL databases, and I've been trying and failing with all of these different queries. And it was a real pain in the butt, and I was getting really close, but then I would fail, and I was just getting frustrated. I've been working on it for like weeks. And one night I had a dream that it was from Doctor Who, the Doctor, the 11th Doctor, Matt Smith, in case you were curious, had a blackboard and literally walked me through the sequel query that I needed to put together to solve my problem. He like had it and he was like writing it out and he's like, this is how you need to do it. This will solve your problem. And I woke up from the dream and I remember like I thank God had like a notebook by my bed and I wrote it down like just half asleep before I forgot it, set it back down and went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning and I had remembered that I had this dream. And I'm like, what kind of nonsense did I freaking write? You know, like what kind of scribbles? And I opened it and like to my absolute shock, it was real sequel like language. I was like, okay, I actually wrote something down. I'm like, what the hell? So I took it to work and it worked. And it was like the basis of a whole project we worked on for almost like a year at this organization. And it like clicked this incredibly difficult problem that no one else was able to help me solve. And it was like, I had a dream that the doctor told me the answer and it worked. I will take that just till if that never happens again, I don't even care. That it happened once was like super amazing. But other than weird situations like that, I unfortunately don't feel like I have a very good connection between my waking and dreaming life.
Your benzene ring experience via sequel.
Yes.
What impels you to create?
I
And even the question feels like it might be like a chicken or egg scenario.
yeah. I was gonna say my instinctive like my knee jerk reaction was like well the same thing that impels me to breathe. But I don't know that that's necessarily as simple as that. I think it's the same as a lot of people. The idea that you can leave a mark on something so big. Not necessarily. I'm not a big legacy person per se, in that I like want immortality, but like it's a very big, seemingly unchangeable thing, just society and people and humanity and life. And it's easy to feel very powerless by creating something real. It's like your little piece of changing this big, seemingly unchangeable thing. And especially when you can create and it connects with other people who then use it or enjoy it or whatever it may be, but it now lives in their brain, like it lives in their life. I know that I've had some kind of an impact on something that otherwise sometimes feels a little intimidatingly unchangeable. And so, whether that's, an app or a therapy, which I love because then I can do it for good. People, one thing I've really enjoyed particularly has been working in chronic pain. And I've recently had the opportunity to collaborate with people who have these amazing therapies that are incredibly effective. And my job has been to help them scale and make sure they don't lose what makes them work. And hearing people who just say, like, I had no hope in having this change my life, like to create something that will get that for other people, to know that even though I'm not in front of it, I'm not a therapist, I'm not the face of anything. No one's ever going to necessarily interact with me, but they might interact with a thing that I created or designed and it might change their life. Like to even be a conduit, it helps me feel a lot less powerless. And so even little things like I like to paint silly pictures sometimes, and when a friend will be like, remember that painting you made that had like the robot, like to know that that memory popped up because of a thing that I had that I made that is real is sometimes just it makes me feel really good. So I think that's probably the impetus of what drives me to keep creating things.
There's so many places I want to go there. One of the one of the concepts I've been thinking about lately, it's almost been a theme, is as people we need an environment or a canvas that is as sensitive as we are to showcase how much we influence the world around us in these subtle ways. And so, yes, if we stand in the river and try to splash about, we won't change very much. Or if we try to, I'm still trying to figure out how to verbalize this. This is me thinking through this very nascent concept. It's almost as if the only way to showcase, to reveal to us how much we can impact something, is to see it reflected on the canvas of another person. That we
Mm.
need someone who's so attuned, or someone is so attuned to our actions, that we're able to convey and see how everything that we do affects something. Otherwise, it becomes invisible. Use a remote. Yes, there's infrared light coming through there. You don't see it, but you can catch it in the camera. If you're chatting with somebody, if you're interacting with somebody who is receptive, you can see how they change. The mood, the face, the expressions, the heart rate. That is the only canvas that's sufficient to convey all the subtleties, is another human body. And I think you just described that aspect when you were in describing the people who benefited from the work that you've created, and not realizing that anything could have helped them, that they helped you see that aspect for yourself of your rippling concentric circles of interaction with the world around you.
Yeah. And it's also a practice of scope, you know, when like the river metaphor you just used, if you splash some water out of the river, you're not going to change the flow of the river. But if you shift your focus and you think about who did you impact, like what about the bacteria in the water that you scooped up and threw out, or the ants on the shore that you just kind of like threw the water on, you fundamentally changed
Yeah.
a huge part of them, either temporarily or permanently. And so I have to keep my focus sometimes when it comes to creativity and purpose, which I think for me are kind of like intrinsically wound together. I need to make sure I'm focusing my attention on the right thing. You know, have I cured a major disease and eradicated it from the world? No. Um, you know, am I world famous and people will remember me forever? Like, no. But I helped, the people who came to an experimental clinic that I pushed for and got started, and we were able to do therapies that like were new and unused in that area, and they got better. Those people got better. Do they get better and like think, oh, thank you to Bethany? Like, no, they probably don't know who I am or wouldn't remember me at all, except for maybe I was in the office one time while they were getting better. It's part of a whole thing, but I feel really good knowing that the parts that I played had those effects on those things. And those are the things I'll focus on. And maybe one day something bigger will happen, but even if it doesn't, that's okay. Cause I'm trying to keep that focus on the things that are impacted. Cause you can always focus on the river and be disappointed that you didn't change the flow of it. But I don't want to do, that's the kind of stuff that I think would push me to feel like I wasn't doing anything, and I'd ignore the things I was doing. So when it comes to it, yeah, a lot of it is just making sure I'm micro focused as opposed to like macro focused on positive benefits, and let those build up to organically create the macro benefits if I can. So that's been helpful. And so I do always love to get that feedback, good or bad, from people.
I like to think of the word effort as as containing the word work. So when we work, it's where we
Mm.
expend, it's a way of directing our effort, but we don't only expend our effort or direct effort within work. There's vocation, exploration, curiosity, side projects. So using the term, the most expansive version of that term effort, in areas where you apply that, what does it do for you and what does it do for others?
I genuinely have always really loved the feeling of exerting effort in like a driven way. I love flow, like just working hard at something, no matter what it is. So for me, it's very like sensory. It's very like very basic as far as that goes. Um, and for others, I just kind of want to make whatever I can of another person's experience for as long as I can or as much as I can pleasant. Like just generally, and I exert a lot of effort towards that. Like just pleasantness, shared pleasantness or not, but like just to make that person feel for some part of some way good. Just plain good. Whether it's like cooking something comforting or smiling at them at the grocery store instead of just like keeping a neutral expression or glaring at them or whatever it may be, but like I do appreciate like putting that energy, that effort towards things that will bring joy to other people. Because for me, just putting effort into something that's meaningful to me is inherently joyful. So it doesn't feel like a chore. And I like to just kind of like share it along a little bit.
I have a pair of questions that seem to work together with each other. Um, what questions do you hope to answer in your lifetime? And what questions do you hope to still ask, but you haven't yet found the right circumstances or environment to ask them?
I think there's like a circle of essentially the same basic question. What can I do to change a should into a want? Like, what can I do to help people find the pleasure, the joy, the internal motivation to do the things that help them do continue to do well? And so often, we feel like we're working against the grain or something is a chore or something is bad, but we have to do it. And it like adds this whole vibe to your life of just blah, like feeling like it's not yours and feeling like you're misusing your time or misusing what you have. And if I can find ways to answer for people at large, how do we make this fun? How do we make this what you want? How do we make this good so that they can spend their lives doing something that is helping them, but also inherently making them feel good? And like everything just feels nice and balanced. They don't feel like they're neglecting something for a thing that they have to do. That's so important to me. And so I don't think it's a question that could ever be fully answered because you maybe can answer it for a person, for a thing, or even a thing for lots and lots of people. But there's going to be all kinds of other things. So it feels like it's the question that I want to answer, but also probably the question that I never will. And I want to keep on answering for others and for myself. Like, how do I make this great? How do I make this fun? How do I make this inherently enjoyable so that all the things we need to do in order to live like a productive and comfortable and healthy life are also the things that we do to live a happy and fun and adventureful life. So I think that is the answer to both of those questions. I hope I never get tired of asking it, and I hope to answer it as many times as possible.
How has your curiosity and how have your efforts led you to finding the right people for you?
I mean, I think I'm always in that process. But trying to have enough curiosity about what is really kind of at the core of a person, not so much what they do, but why they do it. Keeping that curiosity alive so that it's not really about what they do. It's about understanding why they do it. Because that way, if you come across like a fundamental disagreement, you understand where they're coming from, and it makes it a lot easier to figure out the middle ground. And I think the more I can do that, the more people are my people. And, I don't need to worry so much about what people do the same things as me or what people look like me or what people like the same things I like. It's more just, you know, where are people at where we fundamentally can like push and pull and meet each other's needs in a way that's, um, helpful and 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 feels good. Like it's complementary. So I think that that's just keeping mind to like what's driving the things at the surface.
Going back to nostalgia, which itself feels like a fun that is what one does with a nostalgia.
Yes.
What's one memory that you revisit regularly?
I have a lot of them. I think when you asked that and I sat there and tried to think what's my favorite, I will say that there was always a time, usually around the change of the season, and especially when it started to get kind of nice outside, whether that was because it was springtime or fall time when it was finally cooling down after a really hot summer. There would be a weekend, and this was yeah, like every few months or so, where my family, there were four of us, would just decide it was time to really deep clean the house. And we would open up every window, and everyone was just sort of like responsible, usually for like you started with your room, and then we would share out the tasks. And my dad would do a lot of the work outside. And we had a big radio in the middle of the house. And they would, my parents would turn it on to some music and turn it up really loud. And you could hear it all through the house. And we'd all be working together to like clean up the house and just kind of like get it fresh in the air. And I just still remember like those days where we would do that and you'd work and it felt good and you could feel you were like putting that energy back into the house. And by the end of the day, usually, you know, my parents would, like, my dad would be maybe barbecuing outside. My mom would be cooking in the kitchen, and you'd be taking a break because you'd just be like tired because you had been, cleaning and working all day. And the house smelled so good, like fresh air and clean. And everybody just kind of felt good and productive. And we did that all the time. It just felt like so kind of ritualized almost, but it was also just like a very simple thing to do. But the sensations of that come back to me all the time. It was like such a weird thing. It's like not a family vacation. It's not like something that was like, probably my parents are going to be like, are you kidding me? Like we saved up for like 5 years to take you to Disneyland and you remember like when we cleaned the house. But like it, I just I always have such fond memories, and it comes to me all the time, that feeling of like being done doing a thing that was inherently like you have the immediate benefits of it, and to just smell that like clean fresh air and like the smell of food cooking and everybody just feeling good and like we had done something together. I loved those feelings and I come back to them a lot.
What's something that you're surprised didn't come up as a question?
You didn't ask me, and this is a good thing, you didn't necessarily ask me about my work in a very specific way. You asked me about the things that fuel my work and like the hungers and the joys of my work. And I really love that. It's new. Usually when I'm doing something like this, it's for work and it's talking about what project are you doing or how are you doing this or how would you describe the study of this, which I don't mind. And I love to do like science education and things like that and talk about my work. But to visit these things that are so commonly just sort of like floating around in kind of my in like my stomach and like my veins, and to like bring them to light and think about them and give words to them, I love it. So I don't think I yeah had a lot of expectations, but I am relieved to not have just talked about the details of my work but to talk about like the inner workings of them.
When you were thinking about the concept of this episode, what's something that you were hoping to be able to share about your inner landscape?
I think I just hope that I was hoping to have a chance to be genuine and just myself, which I often am, but I hope in doing so, like that something genuine that I've been able to share would resonate with somebody I don't know and probably will never meet and will never see. But I was hoping that, yeah, like something just that is meaningful to me that might be so unimportant in the scope of things in the world and so silly and unrelated to things might be the thing that like rings in the memory of a person I will never encounter myself. I love the idea of that. And I hope that is something that can happen, but we'll see. I'll never know. I'll just tell myself it happened and I'll feel really
Until we have the
good.
first interlandscape travel agency community gathering where guests and listeners come together.
Yeah.
It's you, Bethany. You did this for me. Signing autographs.
When you talked about how the number one is red, it just changed my whole mind.
When you reflect on your life till now, what patterns emerge for you?
Hard-headedness in good and bad ways. I when I want to do something my way, good or bad, hell or high water, I've done it. Either to absolute disaster and humility of having to say, oops, that was really wrong, or to the absolute joy of realizing it was fine, that it was right, and I could do this thing that other people maybe thought was impossible. But I've done a lot of things. Not all of them have been impressive. Not all of them have been successful. But I don't think that anyone could argue that they weren't all very much my own. And so it's something I guess I'm proud of. I don't know if I'm proud of it, but it is defining.
One of the main areas of focus within this conversational portrait notion is about capturing how people are fully becoming themselves and how you are fully becoming yourself and the continuous process thereof. In reflecting on this conversation, how do you feel about the person you're becoming?
As we've been talking, I realize how much I've been able to understand and sort of articulate the idea that I don't like hierarchy or forced boundaries, and that I really love the ebb and flow of things. And in that, I like letting the different disparate parts of me and my life and my self also ebb and flow. And there have been times when I was younger where I tried to be much more constructive, like, oh, well, I don't want to use this from my past, or like, I didn't like this, so I'm not gonna have that be a part of who I am, right? Like just trying to think that like you could somehow be conscious in the construction of yourself, which I think everybody in their like teens and 20s is convinced they can do, right? Um, and then recognizing that all of the parts of me, whether they're things I'm really proud of or things that I'm not proud of or things that I love or things that I like don't love so much that I've rubbed up against, they're all coming in there. They're all having an influence, and I need to relax and just let them all be and let them flow and let them interact and see what those interactions do and what they teach me, and see how new things I introduce into the mix interact with the old things, and just sort of let it be and not be such a an alchemist about it, try and force it into something that it isn't. I I see that, and as we've talked, it's been sort of unconsciously a theme in so many of the things. When you ask me about my beliefs on things or my perspectives on things, it's come up a lot as a theme, this idea of like flow and a lack of hierarchy. And I realized in reflecting on all of these things how much that's shaped who I am, who I'm continuing to sort of be.
We started off with learning about where you find your silence. And so now I'd like to give you the silence to have and or to fill. So the space is now yours.
I will say, in this silence that may be partially awkward, but hopefully not entirely so, as anyone is listening to it, that you're realizing you have the time to pay attention to where you are and what you're doing, and find the joy and inherent beauty of what it is, and just respect it for what it is.
Thank you, Bethany Ranes.
Thank you.
And that is your conversational portrait.
That was so much fun. My gosh. You were an incredibly gifted conversationalist, sir. Thank you very much. Like, this whole experience was incredibly enjoyable.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Can I ask you about your comment? This may have been in the first third because it has been 3 hours. Um, about you mentioned about being a good therapist.
Yeah,
What is that? What did that mean for you?
a good therapist. I think it's somebody who has a completely unselfish desire in that moment to listen to another person and kind of give all of their energy to that person to give them whatever they need, in that moment. And I very much respect people who have that passion. And I think when I interact with people, while there's no malice in it, I still have a selfish desire to sort of like think about, well, why this? And like my curiosity gets the best of me and I want to know things. And it would be so hard for me to be a therapist and I like just ask things out of pure curiosity that that may not be relevant to what a person needs, right? I would want to just be like, why do you think that? Like, what about this? Do you think it has something to do with this? And I think a good therapist is somebody who can kind of turn that off and just be entirely focused on that person and their needs and not have that selfish need or interest. Like they might have it, but they can like take distance
Mhm.
themselves from it. I think I would really struggle with that aspect of it, just that selflessness of it. And I think that's really lovely. And it's not just therapists. I think like a good teacher um, is that kind of a person too, like just or a coach or whoever it may be, that person who's just like there to give you what
Mhm.
you need in that moment by like listening to you and hearing that and like providing it for you without their own stuff, right? Like, because a conversation, a good friend, you kind of need to bring your own stuff to it. Like a good conversation is sort of got a little selfishness to it, or otherwise it wouldn't be as interesting. But I think those relationships are different where you kind of almost need
Mhm.
to be tuned down a little bit. You need to give up your half of that conversation and your half of the relationship and give it to the person that you're focusing on. And yeah, I think that's, like I said, it's not just a therapist, but certainly therapists and anybody who's kind of in that kind of a role, a human mechanic of sorts.
That's a fascinating observation. I've been definitely playing to the extent to which I contribute my own portions versus ask, and I think the questions are quite selfish because I'm just curious about who you are, and
Yeah.
and so like that, and, and also I hope that is in its own way therapeutic. Um, my reference point or the types of things I'm reading now, here's some Carl Rogers, here is some um, what's his name? James Hillman. Like I am reading therapists' work because I think that because they're genuinely curious about people. And
There. Yeah. I love Carl Rogers. How do you not love Carl Rogers? The original Mr. Rogers.
and so I hope it doesn't come off as a therapy session, and yet
No,
I I want it to be it in itself a non-therapy session, but a therapeutic experience.
certainly. I would call it, it's not therapeutic for therapy's sake. You're not trying to fix me. And I think that that's inherently a big
Mm-hmm.
part of therapy. Like a person coming into it's a social contract
Right.
where inherently one person is coming to another
Mm-hmm.
person to fix them. You don't you are not doing that. That you are flowing on the natural tide of another person's conversation with absolutely no direction of your own beyond hearing what they have to say. Is that naturally therapeutic? Like, yeah, probably. It's certainly very fun and like it's you are very creative. So you like engage me to think with parts of my brain and like put to words things that I don't that I kind of take for granted. Um and then in doing so find patterns I otherwise probably wouldn't have noticed because I wasn't working to put the words to them. So I would say in that way it's unintentionally therapeutic, yeah. But it's lovely to talk to you because you very obviously are not coming into this to fix or drive. You are incredibly good at letting it. I would imagine each of these is going to always be so different because you're so good at not driving it in any direction. You are You were just letting your curiosity, like you're just kind of following the natural tenors of it. So it's like if there were, the valence is still lovely and positive and a good feeling, but like I think on the, there's a continuum somewhere where like your EQ is turned completely the other side, like where therapy is like, I am not part of this at all. I'm just here to fix this person. You're like the very opposite of like, I am all about this. Like, I want to learn as much about this person as possible, but also share it because other people might too. So, like, in that way, I think you're diametrically opposed to therapy, but in so many of the other things, you have a lot of similarities. If that makes sense. I hope that's not offensive. I don't mean for it to be. In fact, I mean for it to be very complimentary.
Um, no, that makes me feel seen. That is wow. That is a profound level of a description that I don't think I've experienced before. I think like the idea of a therapist, the idea of a coach, like yes, it helps some. I was drawn to positive psychology, the idea of regular psychology. Like, well, let's make
Of
somebody
course.
less bad. Like, no, I want them to thrive, but also, the thing I've always been drawn to is the idea of someone being fully themselves. Like, how can that be something that someone can, and you can't force someone to do that. You can only help them realize that or see that in themselves, and that yes, I'm going to be reviewing. I'm so glad I'm still recording. I'm going to be reviewing this moment for a bit to understand more of what you said about the diametrically opposed in terms of
I think you have a genuine love of peopleness, and that doesn't surprise me that you would love positive psychology because of the optimism about peopleness. I hate that word, but I can't think of another word for it because humanness is too clinical. This is peopleness, like the personalities, the quirks, the inner workings. But I think you might not make as good of a positive psychologist because I think you love the natural state of it too much. You are so well suited for where you are. A positive psychologist is still trying to
mm,
fix the peopleness, whereas you're like an admirer and a curator of the peopleness. Like you're letting the
mm-hmm,
peopleness be because you just enjoy it. I think for you, you don't see a thing that needs to be fixed. You probably just genuinely love people's peopleness for what it is. And it's not like a person that you adore or anything like that. I think you have the capacity to genuinely just enjoy everybody and their peopleness, whatever it may be, which is tough because, like, what is that other than Mick doing his shows and his conversational portraits? Because, like, there's not like a great place that you're a lovely person, but it's like we don't even in our society have a good place for where you would put that because you're not trying to change it. You're just appreciating it and highlighting it. I think you probably would actually. I mean, like if you're looking at the what to get to at the end, you would be an amazing positive psychologist. But in the getting there, I feel like they would like come after you because you don't have a natural wanting to change people. You have just a wanting people to appreciate themselves as much as you appreciate them, and that's so beautiful. Actually, it probably should be what therapy is. It just, but it's not what society has made therapy to be.
it is the, the word that's coming up is disorienting, but it's not. It it feels like an accomplishment to hear that I'm not trying to change someone, that I'm in, because that is so far away from what I remember being most guilty of in my youth. Or not even in my youth, like even like 5 years ago, even a couple years ago, like I was always, you should be this way. I would impose, like I would see someone, I would
Ah,
see the gap between who I want them to be because of their potential, and then faulting them for that. And even if I'm trying to be encouraging, I would fault them in a way like by encouraging them and faulting them. Like there's this implicit faulting in the encouragement.
I think you've probably just matured to a point where you've realized people are their potential, not their
Mm-hmm.
distance from it. Or maybe you've had a life event that like helped you along that. But from what I can gather, it's probably a sense that you're moving away from, or at least in this role, you're recognizing people just as their potential. And that's like what you're seeing. And you're not necessarily focusing on whatever their momentary difference from that ideal potential is. Like you're just giving them the potential, which I think is lovely. Like it will help. It's got to make people look so beautiful all the time. Like to just see them as their potential. Give them the benefit of their doubt all the time. It's probably just something too that you learn as you get older and you realize like sometimes when you're not at your best, it's not through any fault of your own. It's just sometimes you just aren't. We're constantly we're ping pong balls moving around all the time. You're just sometimes not going to be on that. But you don't give me the impression of a fixer through this conversation or the last conversation we had at all. So whatever it is in your approaches that you have changed, they have changed quite dramatically.
One of my goals for this was definitely to be around the people who get it, whatever it is. And this time, it is a positive word, and to be around the folks who see the depth or the not yet the yet nebulous thing I'm trying to build. That I don't quite know what that path looks like or what that destination looks like. It's a cattywampus. It's an intentional wandering in a vague direction towards it, but it's to. I think this goes back to like you have to be around people are the canvas that other people need to see just how much they impact. And what you've shared helped me to understand like, oh, there is something there. And in the way in which you view the world helps me understand it's an appraisal from somebody whose perspective and experience I treasure. Because of what you do and what you bring, like you're a person that I aspire to be around. And it was palpable as soon as we started chatting. Like it was the interest in like, oh great, like yes, and so to get that from someone is so, yeah, that is. It's not affirming. It's not validating. It's like
Is it
it's more
rewarding?
than that. It's like a soulfully enriching experience. Even that feels trite. Like it's insufficient.
Sometimes you just can't put
But I
words on them,
love
Mick.
words.
Sometimes the words are just not. Sometimes the words are
I'll
flimsy.
need some other language. That's the only answer.
Lisa Feldman Better would be proud of you. You've got to go talk to like some kind of lovely, warm, interconnected society of people living somewhere where they haven't been tinged by the ugliness of modern society and go figure out what their word is for a like meaningful, soulful connection.
I have aspired to meet those folks.
My God, I would never leave. Are you kidding me? They probably would want to kick me out. Like, okay, you're done now. You're good. You can go home
You
now.
have learned your lesson. Please let us escort you.
Please go away.
Thanks again, Bethany, for the episode and your willingness, your how forthcoming you are, how much you've explored, and how much you feel comfortable sharing, and this off the stage talk.
It's you're I hope that we can maintain a friendship because you are like such a brilliant conversationalist. This has been one of my favorite conversations I've had in such a long time. I'm heartbroken that we couldn't have had you when I was over at United and we had all the scientists together working together, having you just in the mix, like our resident philosopher, like in just like catalyzing these fabulous conversations. You would have probably just been absolutely in heaven too, like having all of these different perspectives to play with. But yes, you're lovely to talk to. Your perspectives and like how you see people in a way that I think is very beautiful. Like you see people as inherently fascinating, and you take the time. Like you have the patience that I wish I had to like really take the time to see people. You put so much thought into this conversation. It was wonderful. Like so thank you for just having this is such a luxury that it exists in the world. I cannot wait for like hearing all of these conversations with all these different people that you have. Like I could listen to you have conversations with people for the rest of my life and be thrilled.
Oh. I don't have words for that. I just have sounds of gratitude.
Well, likewise, my friend. This has been deeply enjoyable. I'm going into my weekend now with like a whole new sense of like introspection that I would not have otherwise had. So thank you very much for that. And yeah, keep on doing this, please. Oh my gosh, I
Thank you,
love it.
Bethany. Have a wonderful weekend.
All right, you too. I'll
Bye.
talk to you soon. Bye.